Damn it, I did it again. Okay. Zoinks, zoinks, zoinks. Kerm the Derm, Bella, Astanex, Mercy, Jan Yarvis, welcome all into the stream. Man, why do I keep doing this? It's so annoying. So yesterday we watched a couple videos by The Elden Conspiracy and Smotown, What is the Rune of Destined Death, and Radigan of the Golden Order, respectively. They were both fun, and we had a lot of thoughtful discussions about both videos and went way over time, which is perfect. And hopefully today we won't go quite over our time, but on the docket for today we have Bloodborne 8 years later. While it's still from Software's true masterpiece, a retrospective by MrTommoTalksGames or MrTommoTalksGames. And I haven't watched anything from them before, so if this is all just praise for Bloodborne, it might be a little bit boring, but if it is just praise, I'm sure I'll be able to provide some criticism as well, even though it is one of my favorite games. So, a long one, curious as to what it's going to say. And then next we have OTH, O the Humanities, How Bloodborne Transforms the Myth by SolePorpoise. We have watched another video by SolePorpoise on, what was it? Saying Goodbye to Souls Games, and we had a lot of discussion about that one. And this is a thumbnail that I've seen for a very long time since it's a 6-year-old video, but it's a video that I've never watched. So, quite curious to see where we go with that one. So, hope you're all doing well. Thanks for letting me know I was muted. Oh, Hawkshaw put out a new video? Okay, thank you. Yeah, my mic doesn't really have a light on when it's muted, but sometimes I just need to pay more attention to what I'm doing, really. Because I do have OBS open, and if I looked at the little icon, I could have seen that I was muted, so it's definitely my fault. But, yeah. It's about the celebrants in the Dominula? Okay. Okay, yeah, if you type it into, like, my video comments, I'll add it to the list, because otherwise I'm just going to forget over the next 3+ hours that we stream. But thanks for letting me know. And I did debate actually looking at Hawkshaw's Ancestral Followers videos today, but I figured Bloodborne was a good choice as well. Alright, so let's go ahead and dive on into the first video for today by MrTommoTalksGames. From's Greatest Triumph. I know it's quiet now, but I don't know how their voice is going to be, so give me a second and then I might turn it up.
Every year since 2015, without fail, veteran players return in droves to the blood-soaked, moonlight-washed streets of Yharnam.
Alright, so how's the sound for you guys? It seems a little low on my end, just from like the voice, but it looks like the decibels are kind of normal. So maybe he just has like a quieter voice, I don't know.
Descending upon the cobblestones like a sweeping curtain of crows to resurrect Bloodborne anew once again, each time for a new generation of players. This event, this pilgrimage of hunters known as Return to Yharnam, begins from the anniversary of Bloodborne's launch and lasts a whole 2 weeks. During the event, players new and old engage in the game's co-op, both helping and hindering each other, returning the game to a level of activity similar to its launch so many years ago, when the streets were freshly awash with the blood of beasts. Outside of the Souls series, which often inspires such fervent fandom, this sort of dedication, devotion even, feels almost unprecedented. Bloodborne, as of 2023, is a massive 8 years old, yet it continues to delight and captivate players even today. Even players like myself, who profess to know the game inside and out, find plenty of joy in walking those streets once again, under the dreadful light of a blood moon. Bloodborne is my favourite game I've ever played. It's the best game I've ever played, and as far as I'm concerned is From Software's magnum opus, their masterpiece title, a pitch-perfect legendary example of exquisite design, both in its gorgeous, intricately crafted world and art, and of course its timeless, impeccable gameplay.
Those are some pretty bold claims. I'm trying to think of what would actually be like my favorite game I think the original Final Fantasy VII is really up there, but that might also just because of like nostalgia more than anything else. And then I also really like Suikoden 2. It's a phenomenal game, and I have a soft spot in my heart for like a lot of those JRPGs. But yeah, I mean, Bloodborne's a fantastic game, and in some ways, I do like Super Smash Bros. Ultimate more, just because I feel like it's kind of a more complete game, ironically enough. But I guess I'm just really harsh on criticizing games because I gave Bloodborne like an 8 out of 10. But yeah, for me personally, I think, yeah, I'll just leave it there. Strife is life. Ban Strife. Yeah. Boxer Ring 1970, nice to see you again. And Kerm the Derm, it's been a while. Nice to have you back in chat.
Am I just here to gush about Bloodborne today? Well, maybe. What is there really left to say about one of the most critically acclaimed, picked apart and analysed titles of recent memory? Well, I want to try and make it a little more personal. 8 years on from the release of Bloodborne in March of 2015, why do players continue to return to Yharnam time after time? What is it about Bloodborne that stirs an undying flame in the hearts of players? Is it as simple as a drive, a thirst, an unending hunger? A hunter must hunt after all. There's a pull to the world of Bloodborne that only those that have experienced it will truly understand. Making our way through the eldritch insanity felt like an isolating, lonesome journey at first, but really it was a community baptism in madness. So why is Bloodborne often called one of the greatest games of all time? What is it about this particular game that roots it so deeply in the minds of many?
So, for my initial guesses, I would say Bloodborne might have the strongest presentation that combines like aesthetics, themes, and gameplay all in one. And I think that's really hit or miss for a lot of players, because I know a lot of players didn't get into Bloodborne because they weren't into the kind of gothic Victorian aesthetic of this one specifically. And some others just prefer the more high fantasy titles like Dark Souls and Elden Ring, which is perfectly fine. But yeah, I think just the overall presentation of Bloodborne might be the strongest. The combat is the second quickest after Sekiro, obviously. So I think Bloodborne's sound design really helps elevate it, maybe a step above the other games, but it almost feels like apples and oranges to really compare them.
In this retrospective, I want to dive back into the darkness. This is my manifesto, my letter to you and my ode to one of the best games ever built. If you've played Bloodborne before, you'll probably get where I'm coming from, but if not, then I implore you to try it if you can. In fact, it's still free right now as part of the PlayStation Plus collection on PS5, which is an unbelievable steal. There's no better time to jump in than when the moon hangs low over the streets of Yharnam. Just be
No, it'll be better once we get Bloodborne on PC, right, guys? Right?
careful you don't turn into a beast yourself. Welcome to Bloodborne, a retrospective return to madness. I imagine my history with Bloodborne is one that's fairly common among players. For me, it all began in 2014, almost at the very beginning. At 21 years old, I was fresh out of university, and at the time the PlayStation 4 was riding high. It stood head and shoulders over the Xbox One as the player's choice of console after Microsoft's incredibly botched launch just 6 or so months prior. But even with the immense goodwill behind it, the truth was PS4 didn't have that many must-have exclusive titles to its name yet.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say. Like, my memory of the time when Bloodborne came out was that neither console had, like, truly taken off just yet in terms of, like, the software that they offered. Although Microsoft really bungled the launch of Xbox. for that version of the Xbox. I forget which title is which at this point. And this kind of, to me, represented like the turning point in like launching the platform beyond just being like the next gen, where it became more of like, okay, you guys really need to get in with this new generation of games. They're completely different. So yeah, I think I'll leave that alone for now.
At the time, I'd enjoyed launch title Killzone Shadowfall, and yes, even Knack to some degree, but the title I'd considered the first real jump to next-gen was none other than infamous Second Son, released in March of 2014. This was during a time where, if I could afford to, I was determined to pick up as many PlayStation 4 exclusives as I could to well and truly embroil myself within the ecosystem. Looking back, I
that sounds really kind of like melodramatic to me. I mean, games are games, but I don't want to like poop on this guy's taste too badly. I actually did pick up Infamous Second Son. I was really, really excited about the game because of like all of the trailers and stuff around it. It really felt like a cool, kind of more realistic version of like what if there were superheroes. I hadn't really heard of the Infamous series before that. And then when I did play it, I was a little bit disappointed at how kind of short and linear the game was. Or maybe not like linear. It was just a lot shorter than I was expecting, and not as riveting as I hoped it would have been. But it was still a very enjoyable game, all things considered.
I think this mindset stemmed from a combination of the excitement that was seemingly constantly ramping up around the PS4 itself, even post-launch, and it being a time in my life where I was finally beginning to get into games, so to speak. That's not to say I hadn't been playing games religiously since the era of the N64 and the PS1, but as a young adult I was starting to understand not just the games I was playing a bit better, but the relentless industry marching behind them. It was an exciting and, frankly, formative time. But I'd never played a Souls game in my life. I'd never even heard of From Software. The only piece of information I tangentially knew was that the Souls series, at this point simply the trifecta of Demon Souls, Dark Souls, and Dark Souls 2, was renowned for being difficult, punishingly so, and that turned me away from them at the time. From Software and Souls was such a blind spot for me that I completely missed and would never have understood the implications of the leak of Project Beast, our first look at what Bloodborne would become, featuring such oddities now as...
So yeah, when Bloodborne came out, I had played Dark Souls. At that time, I don't think I'd completed it, and it was on my like list to go back and play through and finally beat, but I had a lot of other stuff going on in my life at the time, so it was just kind of on the back burner. And then when I saw all of the trailers for Bloodborne, I was like, holy crap, this looks like a game for me. And I think there was another game like Order 1886 or something like that, 1876. And that one just, there was a lot of hype around it when it was first coming out, and then it just immediately died off. I think it got like remastered somewhat recently, but those are like literally the only two things I've ever heard about that game. Whereas Bloodborne has obviously stuck around, and we talk about it all the time. Obviously, I'm very biased with the focus of my channel here, but yeah, it was kind of funny that I put two and two together that FromSoft created Dark Souls and Bloodborne like way after the fact, because like the pedigree of that company didn't really have too much of an impression on me, even though like I was kind of familiar with their games. So it was really once Bloodborne came out that I like really kept FromSoft on my radar, and they haven't really missed since, have they?
The cleric beast in the Grand Cathedral that would later become the boss room of Vicar Amelia, for instance. I was there, however, when the name Bloodborne was leaked prior to E3 2014, though I never put two and two together like so many others. And so, E3 2014 arrived, and Bloodborne was first revealed to the public with a CG trailer. I didn't really know what to expect, and where I imagined stalwart From fans were already excited, I wasn't. I wasn't even really sure what I was looking at, but I was curious. As mentioned before, it was a confirmed PS4 exclusive, so I was leaning towards trying it anyway. But what really caught my eye was the slivers of a setting that we got to see. For those of you that don't know, the Victorian Gothic is one of, if not my absolute favourite settings, visual designs and motifs in media. Just seeing that sweeping shot of Yharnam moving from the crooked, eerily ghost-lit rooftops to the densely packed yet abandoned alleyway laden with chains and statues was enough to get me intrigued. This initial reveal was absolutely oozing with atmosphere, a dripping horror vibe, and an obvious creative talent that helped it leap off the screen in comparison with the rest of the show's offerings. A mob of seemingly mutated, almost animalistic townspeople trudged by firelight, as what I assumed was the player character picked them off in ruthless silence, save for the sickening crunch of his weapon embedded into sinewy flesh. And the player character himself, complete with tricorn hat and leather mantle, looked absolutely striking. A gothic interpretation of an old English highwayman, almost. The trailer ends, in retrospect, somewhat oddly, with the cleric beast, the game's first optional boss, attacking the character deep inside what appears to be a tomb of sorts. The cleric beast is never fought here, but it did provide a tantalizing glimpse at the incredible art direction and enemy design the game would employ. I was definitely intrigued, but upon further research, realizing this was at least somewhat related to Dark Souls, I was concerned that while the setting and haunting atmosphere captivated me, the game would be inaccessible. It would be far too hard. It was daunting. However, come August of that same year, our next big look at Bloodborne materialized in the form of the Gamescom gameplay announcement trailer, finally providing those of us new to Souls games with a deeper, clearer look at what we'd actually be doing in this grim new world. And
if I remember correctly, this trailer, the Japanese version, Willem has a different quote, and this might be the one where he says, like, the blood makes us human, makes us more than human, and then human no more. I think something along those lines. So this is kind of one thing that stood out to me about this one, because this is a trailer that I don't really see very often for whatever reason. I mean, it's not like I go out of my way to watch the trailers a lot anymore these days, but it's certainly the like the E3 trailer is the one that stands out for me with Bloodborne. And Beans and Rice and Clown Scum, welcome back to the stream. You're late and you're here. Nice to have you.
Remember it vividly. This was the trailer that got me completely hooked. I hadn't even played the game yet, and maybe it would still prove too difficult. But this, to me, is the quintessential Bloodborne trailer. Gone is the pure focus on horror. Instead, the game is presented as a sublime mix of theatrical gothic flamboyance, incredible action, monstrous abominations, and an intriguing mystery woven into the centre of it all. As the ominous, gravelly-voiced narrator breathes the words, "The Hunter's Return," as if lost on the wind, we see that very hunter walk the streets of Yharnam itself. As the sinister backing music begins to
I do wish we could have played a version of Bloodborne with like this lighting system, just because it looks so different. Which isn't to say like the version that we have is bad, but there's just something kind of very striking to me about this one. How do you guys feel about it? Because I know like other people have wanted this in the past. I'm just curious about you guys in chat, or even if you're even aware of these differences.
To build cackling hags dance madly in the fields. And finally, ending on a more game-accurate appearance of the cleric beast this time, the music abruptly comes to an end, with the visuals lingering on a hunter's dream aflame as a man in a wheelchair and his companion look on silently. In my mind, this trailer masterfully captures everything that makes...
Isn't it great how they spoiled the hunter's dream burning in the trailer? Actually, I'm pretty sure the E3 version shows the baby squid, but it's not like people are going to have any idea what the hell that means. But it is funny that this version of the moon is still straight up white and the sky is black. So it does show like that they did continue to iterate on the visuals here and stuff. Astynex would have preferred that lighting, something darker, more true to the time of the day. Yeah. Earthmind, welcome back to the stream. Beans and Rice thinks they look neat, but you can see how it might be difficult to keep them visually consistent, maybe. Especially with like the changes to the day cycle.
Bloodborne so special, and although I didn't know that just yet, it was enough to make me desperate to try it for myself. I mean, just look at the way the hunter faces down those two massive, snarling wolves, only to pull out a colossal curved scythe in response, jamming the blade onto the shaft itself with a visceral bluntness. One of the first
A part of me does die inside that he doesn't call them Scourge Beasts or like the Saw Cleaver, although I didn't actually look at what weapon it was using right then. They're proper names.
Real teases of the trick weaponry mechanic that would prove central to the Bloodborne experience. The music adds wonderfully to the melancholy, somber atmosphere, beginning with a creeping, chilling vocal performance that swells to bombast as the madness takes hold in the trailer. Again, little did I know that this was my first taste of what would become one of, if not my absolute favourite video game soundtrack of all time. A mere month later, EGX 2014 provided me with my first opportunity to go hands-on with the game. If you don't know, EGX is an annual gaming expo held in London, where many of the biggest upcoming titles can be tried out early by the general public. Although EGX's prominence has greatly diminished these days, it feels like back then it was a fantastic experience, and 2014 must have been one of the earliest shows I attended. And after playing Bloodborne for the first time, well, I didn't really get it. At all. I was totally stumped, in fact. Again, I'd never played a Souls game in my life, and it showed. At one point I picked up a pebble, and after pointlessly throwing my Molotov cocktails against a wall as I tried to learn the buttons, succeeded in aggroing the entire Central Yharnam citizen mob with this one rock, resulting in a very quick and very brutal death. Despite that disappointing showing where I didn't even manage to make it to the Cleric Beast, I didn't even have a clue where I was really supposed to be going, I realised that it was my own lack of skill and experience that hampered it and didn't hold it against the game, coming away still enthralled and excited to play the game when it finally arrived the following year. And then if we skip ahead, March 27th, 2015, the game...
Yeah, that has to be pretty rough to play this game for the very first time in your very first Souls-like in kind of such a big public setting. Yeah.
Released here in the UK. Keen to play, but still unsure as to how far into the experience I would even manage to get, I made sure not to put any actual money towards the purchase, instead trading in a bunch of titles at my local game to meet the price point. It was a wary yet optimistic purchase, to say the least. The great irony here being nowadays I'll never pass up a Souls Special Edition. In fact, Millennia sits on my desk to this day. All of this to say, that's why I think my history with Bloodborne is probably a fairly common one. With the rapid ascent of the PS4 at the start of the 8th generation, all eyes were on it and its hotly anticipated titles, meaning for many gamers, Bloodborne was likely their first exposure to From Software and likely their first trip into Miyazaki's world. Interestingly, in retrospect, I can't help but think that Bloodborne was the perfect game to act as an introduction to Souls for me. Making this my first foray into that subgenre meant that I was diving headfirst into the deep end, so to speak, without even really knowing it. I think most would agree that certainly at the time of its release, and maybe even still today, Bloodborne was the hardest of From Software's Souls-style titles. Abandoning the sluggish pace of its predecessors, Bloodborne threw players into the maw of death itself, daring hunters to dance a perilous dance with their now extremely aggressive foes. In fact...
Yeah, it's been so long since I first played Bloodborne that I've kind of forgotten the actual difficulty curve of the game, learning it. So I'm trying to... Yeah, I guess this one should really be harder than Dark Souls 3, if for no other reason than how limited your heals are, and the fact they have to go back and farm them, which is a little bit brutal. DS2 is the hardest. I feel like DS2 is the hardest for other reasons, though. And yeah, as you were saying, I know he said Bloodborne was the best one for him to get into, especially because he loves the aesthetic and everything, but... Yeah, I almost feel like Dark Souls 1 is still probably the best launching point just because of how much slower and more deliberate it is, and it really does teach players a lot of the fundamentals that would come up in the previous titles. And because it's slower, I think it's a lot easier to transition into Dark Souls 2 from that game than going from Bloodborne to Dark Souls 2, because that's what initially happened to me after I played Bloodborne. I went back into DS2 and I was like, no. This is way too slow. It feels like I'm moving through water. And then when you add in all the odd enemy placements of the Scholar of the First Sin Edition and the hitboxes, I was just straight up not having a good time. DS2 is hard due to BS and jank. Yeah. Khan says, why does it feel the opposite to you that Bloodborne is the one you struggled the least with? A lot of it does come up to play styles. Like, I've seen a lot of new players get into Bloodborne and really suffer because they want to take things very slowly and wait for enemies to create openings for them to exploit rather than pressing the attack. And in my experience, when players do that, they miss out on the rallying mechanic and it doesn't really click for them quite the way that Dark Souls wouldn't punish players for doing that. Earthminds thinks DS2's rough to go back to and you want to play it too. Hey, howdy, nice to see you again. Oh yeah, if you played Sekiro first, I could see why Bloodborne would be a lot easier in comparison.
Aggression is the name of the game when it comes to Bloodborne, where patience is often a virtue in Demon's Souls and the two Dark Souls titles that followed, and perhaps the most reliable strategy in those games is to bulk up behind a shield while slowly but surely whittling away at equally defensive and tanky enemies. Bloodborne openly and with disdain does away with all of that, even mocking the passivity that's engendered by using shields in a very nice piece of meta, self-aware commentary.
And that's actually one of my favorite localized lines in all of the games, just because of, I don't know, it's like very direct yet matter of fact, and I don't know, I just think it's worded very well, and the Japanese is a lot more plain in comparison. Oh yeah, I think it's because it like engenders kind of like more Victorian language, so I don't know, it just really works for me.
Using shields in a very nice piece of meta, self-aware commentary. Because this was my first title in the Souls genre, this new hyper-aggressive style of gameplay was all that I knew. It was what I adapted to, what I grew accustomed to. The immensely quick step dodge that can be initiated while strafing with a simple tap of the circle button feels like a blur in comparison to the movement options available in prior entries. So, while Bloodborne offers a very different style of gameplay to its forebears, I think it was on the whole a very beneficial one to learn first. The enemies in particular in Bloodborne are terrifyingly quick, often lunging and leaping at you with no care or worry for self-preservation whatsoever. Of course, some of the trademark hulking Souls monstrosity bosses are still here, and many of the same tried and true tactics apply, but your average enemy is way more likely to get up close and personal with you much faster and much earlier on.
Yeah, just looking at that footage there, I do really admire just how well all of those attacks are telegraphed in terms of them like visually representing that they're about to attack, as well as allowing for a little bit of reaction time when they do move into those animations. Yeah, I knew if you break the church giant leg bone that you can get a visceral.
Speaking of bosses, you only have to look at the third boss of Bloodborne to see this new, different philosophy in action, where many will point to Father Gascoigne as being the first real test of your skills. You're adapting to Bloodborne's new mechanics and style, and they'd be right to do so. For me, no early game boss better encompasses Bloodborne's message to the player than the blood-starved beast. Whether it was by sheer luck or what, I actually found Gascoigne to be fairly easy to take down on my first playthrough. No, it was the blood-starved beast that acted as my personal trial by fire. This wiry, demonic boss stalks you through its arena, often swinging wildly and erratically in your direction, with the possibility of hitting you many, many times at once if caught in the wake of its claw swipes.
Just move left, bro. No, but in all seriousness, it's kind of really funny to me how many people get like tripped up by different bosses. So I think Gascoigne was pretty tough for me. The Cleric Beast was, pretty normal. And then I did manage to one-shot the Blood-Starved Beast because it's just kind of like my pattern to dodge to the left. And then I typically try to dodge to where the enemy first indicates that they're going to strike from, because I know you can move through their attacks, so it just kind of makes sense to do it that way because they would need more time to recover from that animation rather than just like if somebody like raises their right arm, that means like their left arm can still follow up for a combo attack. So I just kind of go to where they indicate. And so I didn't have any problems with the Bloodstarved Beast. And since I one-shot it, I was like riding my high horse. I'm like, man, I am a monster of this game. I don't need to level up anymore. So I like stopped leveling up, which was a big mistake. And I went to Vicar Amelia and got my ass really handed to me because I was using the threaded cane and I couldn't really break her limbs as effectively as if I was using a different weapon. And so she kept healing and I did not have a good time. And that was also when the game had absolutely horribly atrocious load times. So I did actually stop after Vicar Amelia for a little bit because I also had other real life stuff going on. So I came back to Bloodborne after it had been patched and the load times weren't as bad, which isn't to say that even now they aren't super great. You were stuck on Bloodstarved Beast for 5 days? Feels bad, man. Beans and Rice says that the only way Engender's passivity could sound more old-timey is if they also said indubitably. Indubitably, good fellow.
This is a fight where, certainly if you're totally new to the franchise like I was, you'll be kept on your toes from start to finish. And although its weaknesses become clearer to the veteran player, the blood-starved beast feels like an impenetrable, terrifying display of mad brutality, with seemingly very few openings and little chance to react, especially as the fight wears on and it begins spewing poison everywhere. It doesn't help that the music for this boss fight is a cacophony of stress-inducing strings designed to ramp up the tension and the sweat as time goes on.
Yeah, SNX, Bloodborne PC will fix everything. Alright, so this guy's music is a little bit loud when he does his transitions compared to his voice. If you ever sees this little bit of a constructive criticism there.
It's amazing, and it killed me maybe 30 times in total, but once I finally beat it, that was the moment the game's systems truly clicked for me. Bloodborne's speed, its pacing, its ferocity would go on to lay the groundwork for virtually all of From's future titles. Dark Souls 3 would shift away from the slower nature of its predecessors and adopt a style far closer to that of Bloodborne itself, while Sekiro's Shadows Die Twice would condense that high-speed fury down even further, perfecting the art of incredibly fast combat. And finally, most recently, Elden Ring would take it to the next level, with bosses that were more ferocious, more agile, and more capable than anything really glimpsed in Bloodborne at that time 7 years earlier. But because Bloodborne was my first, I've always felt very well prepared for the challenges that came after. Adjusting to the older titles proved slightly harder, and I've never really been a fan of that slowed down, shield up playstyle. In fact,
and yeah, that's why I was saying that I think in some ways going to Dark Souls 1 is a lot better, just because it's a lot harder to adjust from Bloodborne and going back than it is to get something slow and then speed up, in my opinion.
With Demon Souls, Dark Souls, and Dark Souls 2, I've tried to emulate the feel of Bloodborne as closely as possible. But doing so is a more dangerous game, as what you wear in those titles has more of a bearing and more of an impact than it does here in Bloodborne, and I'd often be wearing the bare minimum to move as quickly, to roll as more effectively as possible. That being said, I still think sinking hundreds of hours into Bloodborne first put me in good stead. Finally going back to the original Dark Souls so many years later, and honestly, it felt easy in comparison to what comes after. Bloodborne also works well as a first Souls title due to its streamlined and in some ways restrained nature. As I alluded to earlier, there's a lot less to worry about in Bloodborne overall. No, we're not quite as stripped back as we will find ourselves in Sekiro, but there are far fewer weapons to choose from here, and clothing only really matters in the sense of whether or not you feel like a total badass or not. Whether or not Bloodborne was the birthplace of fashion souls or not, I'm not sure, but it was certainly its peak. No game oozes style quite like it. The idea of trick weapons, one of Bloodborne's best and most versatile mechanics, basically doubles the number of weapons available to you, allowing you to transform each primary weapon you can hold into something more devastating but perhaps more cumbersome to use, or just changing its playstyle altogether. Trick weaponry is something that is exclusive.
Yeah, people often bring up that it's like 2 sets of weapons in one, but I would say it's even more than that, just because even the transformation attacks can add another layer to combat.
To Bloodborne, essentially. And I'd love to see it make a return at some point in the future, because it really is one of the most creative implementations of weaponry the Souls series has really ever seen. There's nothing quite like swiping with Ludwig's Holy Blade only to then slam it into a massive broadsword, even a Zweihander, that's the size this weapon actually is, and bring it crashing down onto an enemy's head. Or maybe you're using the Kirkhammer, which is also a smaller, speedier, scrappier weapon, until you decide to lock it into place in the enormous concrete block that you're somehow carrying on your back and turn it into a massive warhammer. This sort of thing is so awesome, and for me at least made up for the fact that there weren't that many weapons in the game. Again, having not played any of the previous titles, that didn't disappoint me at all, though I know some found that aspect of the game to be a little bit of a letdown.
And I am really sad that Elden Ring didn't incorporate any trick weapons at all. Like when I got the Giza wheel, I was like, oh my god, did they actually incorporate trick weapons too? And they didn't. Even if like the trick weapons didn't have Ashes of War and like their quote unquote Ash of War was like the transformation stuff, that would have been good enough for me. Hey Venom Elastor, welcome to the stream. Nice to see you. Is this Mr. Tommo, like his Bleach stuff? If that's what he's known for, that's who the creator is, yes. I haven't watched anything by him, but I saw this video and figured why not add it to the list a while back.
Personally, even after playing the prior and future titles, I'd probably rather have the innate creativity of the trick weaponry system than hundreds of weapons that I'll just never use. But with all this talk of mechanics and playstyles, we're getting ahead of ourselves. What actually is Bloodborne? What's it about? What are we even doing in this damnable city in the first place?
Oh, don't you worry. Whatever happens, you may think it all a mere bad dream.
Just hunt some beasts, bro.
Until now, I'd structured this video under the impression that you probably know what Bloodborne is, but for the uninitiated that still somehow remain, Bloodborne is an
Yeah, that's funny. The uninitiated 20 minutes in.
action RPG developed by genre masters from Software under the watchful eye of director Hidetaka Miyazaki. Like its accompanying titles, Bloodborne is a tale shrouded in mystery. There's a plot of sorts, but the game is purposefully cryptic and obfuscates much of what you need to know to make it through the night. As a hunter of beasts, you arrive in a crumbling, desiccated corpse of a city known as Yharnam, seeking a cure for a mysterious illness that plagues you. Yharnam is well known across the land for its legendary blood-healing techniques, its blood ministration, the source of which is cloaked in secrecy. But something has clearly gone very wrong by the time you arrive. The city is now at the mercy of a hideous sickness, with the townspeople transformed into beast-like terrors. On the night of the hunt, where the now maddened Yharnamites supposedly venture out in search of beasts to kill, you, the eponymous hunter, must rid the city of their stench, seek out the source of the plague, and escape the never-ending nightmare. To accomplish your goal, you find allies in a seemingly closed-off realm known as the Hunter's Dream. The doll, a quiet, subservient marionette given life, and Gehrman, a wheelchair-bound hunter of old who teaches you the ways of bloodletting.
Farewell, good hunter. May you find your worth in the waking world.
Meanwhile, the hunter's dream itself is an eerie yet picturesque isolated slab of land atop which a workshop sits surrounded by graves and flowers. The dichotomy there between beauty and death is a great one, and it's a line that's often blurred many times over throughout this game. The story of Bloodborne itself is vague, with tidbits of lore being drip-fed to you through item descriptions, inane, often deranged NPC ramblings, and whatever you can scour from your time in the city and beyond. Let's talk about Yharnam, because despite all else it might just be my favourite thing about Bloodborne. Yharnam, the dread city that almost the entire game revolves around, is one of the best, most meticulously crafted and well put together game worlds I have ever had the privilege to explore. The city's many dark, intertwining streets are often tightly packed together, creating a crushing sensation of claustrophobia, the inky black cobblestones laced with a creeping blanket of fog that slithers along the ground, its smoky trails outstretched like the legs of a spider. There's a great mystique to Yharnam. The overwhelming feeling of unease that permeates every step you take is built upon a foundation that something is desperately wrong here.
Yeah, I do agree that Central Yharnam is super well created, so I was a little bit curious if he was going to go into the other areas of the game and say, like, what isn't so great? Because Bloodborne, pretty much like all of the FromSoft games, falls under the category of having an amazing early experience that just kind of falls apart a little bit more and more towards the end of the game, at least in the base game. Yeah, howdy, I can see your messages. If you can look at the left side of my screen over here at this chat, you will be able to see exactly what I see.
Even beyond the fact that the dwellers have all lost their minds, and many their human forms. There's an evil at work behind the veil, and you can't help but feel a sense of sadness as you progress further. The villagers, now monsters themselves, fear you, desperately trying to keep you at bay, believing you to be the plague-ridden rat, when in reality you're here to purge the cobbles of their ilk. The moon hangs low over the cityscape at all times, like a watchful eye, bathing the many towers and spires in its grim glow. The journey through Bloodborne's world, and so by extension the descent into the depths of Yharnam itself, is a spiralling fall into madness.
That is a crazy way to spell Yharnam. Not one that I would have expected from the auto subtitles.
There's evidence to show that Yharnam was once a great city, but it's now literally a shadow of its
Wait, they got it right. That's crazy.
former self, its best and brightest institutions either fallen into darkness or corrupted, twisted and vile. Some may criticise Bloodborne for feeling too samey over the course of its 60 or so hour story, but I couldn't disagree with that more. Don't get me wrong, I love the lands of Lordran and Lothric, for example, but very little about them actually feels cohesive when laid out sprawling before you. When you move from one zone to the next, finding yourself at once in a lava-filled cavern or a poisonous bog or a network of catacombs or a gigantic castle, it might be cleverly interconnected, but it feels at its core like a video game, dropping you from distinguishable biome to biome. Of all the locations the Souls series has ever taken us to, outside of perhaps Ashina Castle, Yharnam feels the most like it could have been a real place at one time.
I feel like the unexplained poison swamp underneath Yosefka's clinic is a little bit much, but generally I do get what he's saying here, though.
Impeccably well designed and fleshed out, from the central hub of the Cathedral Ward, which puts players at the foot of Yharnam's greatest religious monument, the Grand Cathedral, the centerpiece of the entire city, to the ruins.
Speaking of how realistic Yharnam is, one time I went to the Vatican and there were a bunch of priests standing around with crucifixes, and then they just beat me over the head with it, and then I felt like I went insane. Relatable to anybody else?
The Grand Cathedral, the centerpiece of the entire city, to the ruins of Old Yharnam, the original section of the city that was first abandoned and torched to the ground in a vain attempt to stop the spread of the disease. It's the prevailing consistency of Yharnam's world design that actually makes it so appealing to me. Yharnam then is perhaps the area that benefits the most from the Souls series' design philosophy of letting players see the places they can reach eventually at almost any time. Being able to see the belching black smoke of the haunting orphanage of the Upper Cathedral Ward very early on gives players a brief insight into some of the truly despicable evil that's taking place in this city long thought dead. Or
True, and that's like some of my favorite environmental storytelling, even though it isn't very clear that probably what's going on in the orphanage is not on the up and up, shall we say. And Bella, nice to see you again. Thank you for the comments. And you have a good night if you're popping in and out. Sarcastic, nice to see you as well. I always liked the name. Happened to your cousin twice. And Corporate Nothing, nice to see you again. You heard that from the other room. You hate it when you get beaten over the head with a cross, don't we all, man?
Or similarly, being able to glimpse the tattered remains of the Forbidden Woods' windmills through the haze around Cathedral Ward from one of its many spiralling stone staircases and iron-wrought railings. But the glory of Yharnam doesn't just lie in its buildings and landscapes. Bloodborne's central plot might be obtuse, but it's in the smaller, more personal stories that this world truly shines, for better or for worse. On a micro level, Yharnam succeeds massively, introducing players to some of the most famous NPCs in a Souls game to date, each trying either to survive this hellish night or reap the benefits of it.
So, what say you? Our prey might differ, but we are hunters, the both of us. Why not cooperate and discuss the things we've learned?
From the unseen Gilbert, who speaks to you from behind his window pane as he succumbs to his illness, to the seemingly angelic Yusefka, whose clinic you wake up in at the start of the game. The story of Gascoigne's little girl is legendary as she attempts to cross the city herself during the night of the hunt and find her father, only to meet a grisly end in the dank sewers below. As you move deeper into the world,
The pig did it. The pig did it.
you'll encounter fellow hunters and rare allies like Eileen the Crow, whose outfit is reminiscent of a Black Death-era plague doctor, and whose mind walks the delicate tightrope that all bloodlusted hunters must traverse. Will Eileen succeed in purging some of her fellow fallen hunters, or will she too succumb to the blood? While you can directly get involved in the outcome of that particular plot, most of these stories unfold without ever actually seeing the action on screen. It's really very clever and drives that sense of mystery. None of these tales are yours to know without taking the time to explore every inch of the city, and most likely across multiple playthroughs.
What are you still doing here? Enough trembling in your boots. A hunter must hunt.
No game world has
The whole "what are you still doing here" just reminds me of like the ending of Ferris Bueller when he steps out of the shower and he's like, "You, what are you still doing here? It's all over. Go home." Just imagining like Eileen doing something similar to that just tickles my fancy.
succeeded with its atmosphere quite like Bloodborne. Yharnam and its inhabitants are positively dripping in it from start to finish. Whether friend or foe, you can't speak to a character in this game without them trailing off into an ominous chuckling that leaves you questioning their motives, and the haunting, stifling, oppressively funereal nature of the world is exquisite to behold. The entire city is draped in a dreamlike haze, and this feels especially apparent when you stop to take in the surroundings and the skyline in particular, the gleam of the setting sun helping to plunge the city's Gothic architecture into further darkness. The art direction of Bloodborne is so unbridled, so thoroughly confident that it exudes clarity, the clarity of vision. From Software's art team deserves all the credit in the world, for they carry such unfettered heft, such weighty, lofty talent. Almost every angle of Yharnam could be a painting, it's so worthy of watercolours.
I'll be honest, when somebody lays on the praise this thick, it does make me like pay a lot less attention, because when everything is positive, it just kind of like bleeds together and it makes nothing stand out as much in comparison. So my mind is wandering a lot more during this video than some of the other ones. And the funny thing is, I don't even like necessarily disagree with what they're saying. It's just being laid on a little bit thick for me, perhaps.
Perhaps this is why the game has inspired such a fervent art community around it even to this day. Its artistic merit stands head and shoulders above so much else on the scene. Now, despite what you may think so far, the purpose of this video isn't to be a full in-depth look at every facet of the story, every weapon, every encounter, every item, and every aspect of the game. Instead, I want to take you on a journey through Bloodborne itself, visiting the different locations, meeting some of the characters, and experiencing the haunting stories they have to tell, all the while breaking down how everything comes together so fluidly and so naturally as to create one of, if not the best games ever made. Bloodborne is From Software's gothic masterpiece, their crowning achievement in atmospheric environmental storytelling, combined with sublime and above all challengingly fun gameplay. And
yeah, this is the point where it just feels more like an argument from repetition, and I'm starting to get a little bit fatigued by it. I don't know if I'm actually going to complete the video at this rate.
where better to start than at the beginning? Bloodborne is blessed with having one of the greatest opening areas to a game ever. In fact, it's so good that there's an argument to be made the game actually peaks here, in some ways at least. Of course, I'm talking about Central Yharnam. The game begins, and after a definitely above-board blood transfusion and narrowly escaping a beast in the depths of Yosefka's clinic, your hunter heaves open the groaning ornate gates and steps out into Central Yharnam itself.
Yeah, I do think Central Yharnam might be the best designed FromSoft level that they've done, maybe with the exception of like Stormvale Castle, to be honest, but I will say that I think this is the best tutorial area by far, with just how brutal it is, because in the beginning section, it goes way out of its way to teach players to explore, to look around corners, and to stay on their toes and not get greedy. So I do think it's a phenomenally designed area overall. But Jube, nice to see you again. Hang on, this isn't Starfield. Yeah, I didn't get any of those high-speed review codes where I could just look at the game weeks in advance and make a review like a lot of the major outlets. Go figure, right? Yeah, Starfield looks interesting. I don't think I'm going to play it, though, just because I'm very skeptical of Bethesda games. And so far, from what I've seen about the reviews, I am even more skeptical, just because I've seen like a bunch of ones that give the game like a perfect score, yet still have a bunch of like cons against it, which doesn't make sense to me. Zero, thanks for the $2. I appreciate that. This sounds like a fluff video. Yeah, I'm probably going to let it go a little bit longer, and then I might honestly just move into the next one and transition away from this, which feels bad. Scott Leasy says, Central Yharnam isn't that amazing. It's pretty bad at teaching the player how the game works. I think it does a good job because it forces the players into that mindset. Like, it's brutal, don't get me wrong, but I think it's a really good tutorial area. Visually, it's great. As a tutorial, it's a bunch of ganks, which isn't great. I think there's nuance to it. Well, some of them are ganks. It teaches players that you want to pick off enemies, because if you fight them all at once, you're likely to get swarmed. So you want to do things a bit more tactfully. And that, if players can get through like the first area with the burning Scourge Beast, I think they'll have been forced to learn enough of the basics where they'll be able to continue onward up until like they get to the bosses. Because after those two dudes, or not like the two dudes, after the burning Scourge Beast area, you've got the Brick Troll, which, you know, it's a Brick Troll. Well, it's not that big a deal. But immediately after that, there's the little gank squad with the Beastmen who have like the rifles, and some of them are patrolling with the dogs. And I feel like once you're able to get through that section of Central Yharnam and then past the little patrols right there, it will players will pretty much have been forced to have learned like the very, very basics of survival in a FromSoft game. Probably a lot better than in like the Undead Burg of Dark Souls 1. A hell of a lot better than Forest of Fallen Giants, which I think has actual ganks that hit people in their blind side and just kind of like make fun of them for it. And Dark Souls 3's Untended Graves is okay, but I think it's too easy and doesn't really act like a tutorial area, whereas the High Wall of Lothric might be a bit better. But even the High Wall of Lothric is a bit weird and kind of drawn out for a tutorial area, I think. If Astynex could change one thing in Bloodborne, it'd be the pebbles. You'd make them infinite. No, I cannot play Fortnite. After that, it's pretty good? Okay. Going back to the vid for now.
In the context of the rest of the game, this is a perplexing area. The name Central Yharnam would imply this is the hub of the entire city, so putting it first and foremost is an interesting move, especially since I would consider Cathedral Ward to be a more accurate nexus for Yharnam itself. If anything, Central Yharnam seems to be predominantly a residential part of the city, which is why it makes sense that the clinic would be located here. When I think of Yharnam, I think of Central Yharnam most of all. The winding streets and narrow alleys filled with wandering residents, the eerie sound of an axe scraping along the floor, ringing
The dead horses lying on the ground.
loud in the night air. Cobblestone paths, decorative fountains, towering stunning buildings, and overturned carriages paint a portrait of an affluent, even opulent civilization now reduced to death and decay. The residents themselves seemingly unable to even heed what's become of their home. Central Yharnam does an excellent job at introducing you to the world of Bloodborne and its systems. As you round the first corner, the initial enemy is obscured behind a carriage, but there's plenty of wiggle room, space and time to reassess and make a move once combat is engaged. In fact, the first enemy you meet here will be one of the axe-wielding villagers holding a flame torch, and their swing will almost certainly miss, striking the floor instead, giving you an opportunity to take them down. As mentioned before, Bloodborne is all about being aggressive and staying on the front foot as much as possible. A unique mechanic to this game, the regain system, helps facilitate this gameplay, encouraging you to hack and slash away at enemies as much as possible. When you take damage, your health bar will deplete as expected, but rather than emptying completely, in its place remains a paler version of that health you just lost. For a few vital seconds after being hit, you're able to strike back at your opponent and regain some of your lost health. And the game actually affords you precious room to breathe in this first tiny closed-off section of Central Yharnam. But the regain system is a core mechanic that totally defines Bloodborne and tells you everything you need to know about what the developers expect from you. They want you to be savage in your approach. Smart, but savage all the same. After you defeat the first few enemies, Central Yharnam directs you towards your first shortcut, a locked gate that has sealed off the main high street. Instead, you'll have to take the ladder up to the next level, already showcasing this area's multi-tiered approach to design, packed with detail. A shrill scream as you climb the ladder sends a tremor down your spine.
That part is a little bit much, but to answer Howdy's question is, why does the populace call you a beast? The answer to that is when people get afflicted by the scourge of beasts, it eventually affects their eyesight, and they begin to project their own beasthood onto others, and that ties into like being blood drunk. If you think of like actual drunk people, if you're familiar with them to any degree, there's the whole trope of like, I'm not drunk, you're drunk kind of thing that goes on with drunk people, and the same is true in Bloodborne, and that's why like Eileen goes crazy and she says like the hunter needs to be put down because we're drunk on blood when she's the drunk one. Jura kind of makes a reference to that as well when he says like we're half cut with blood, and like half cut I believe is like a British slang which means like half drunk with blood. So it's just kind of like a subversion of a trope on being drunk, because blood in Bloodborne is more intoxicating than alcohol.
There's evidently more than just men with axes to be found here. But look, before you climb, glance out across the chasm at what lies slightly below Central Yharnam to catch sight of one of the prominent towers of Old Yharnam lost to the mists down beneath. As you make your way through the dilapidated streets, you'll encounter various humanoid enemies, mangy dogs, and caped ogres wielding chunks of stone, as well as enormous, prowling, hunchbacked wolves. Easily some of the creepiest looking enemies in the game, with their eyes like embers among coals glinting at you from the shadows. All of this culminates in the first climactic boss battle against the cleric beast, a shrieking behemoth and itself a staunch reminder of how man overstepped its bounds and fell as a result. But there's even more to Central Yharnam than this. Several back alleys which loop round to the start of the area create one of the most satisfying shortcuts in the game, likely to be the first one of real consequence for the player, while an entire sewer network lies beneath the city itself. The sewers, although contained within Central Yharnam, could have honestly been an entire area unto themselves, and discovering the man-eating pig lying in wait is still one of the freakiest moments in the game. It's true, when looking at it from on high, that Central Yharnam is probably one of the most complex and intricately woven areas in the game. Very few areas that follow can really live up to it in that regard, and it makes the absolute most of the wonderful gothic setting surrounding it. But it is also Bloodborne at its most vanilla, and the game only proceeds to get stranger and wilder from here on out. The entire Central Yharnam area is capped off with the first mandatory boss of the game, Father Gascoigne.
So yeah, I do really like the interconnectedness of of Central Yharnam, and the multiple routes you can use to access different areas, well, within the area essentially. So I do wish there was a little bit more going on with here, like going forward, but it's pretty minor. And it would have been cool if you could be able to access Cathedral Ward through the Cleric Beast bridge, but obviously they cut that because of like loading issues. If you're familiar with like Lance's work. So part of me does wonder like how different the game would have been if they didn't have like such technical limitations at the time, but we'll find out with Bloodborne PC, right, guys? Jube wishes they could still play Bloodborne. You sold your PS4 to your best friend so he could play Bloodborne. Yeah. If you do have the PS5, you can get it on there. As they said in the beginning of this video, it's still on like the PS Plus stuff, which, spoiler alert for anybody who may not have heard, they are increasing the prices of all of the PS Plus packages by like 30% or something pretty crazy. So, oof, getting rough out here. All right, going back to the video.
Once a fellow
you got
hunter
PC.
like yourself,
Okay.
driven mad by the beast plague.
Dr. Zaya says, what's up with the new wave of Bloodborne lore content lately? I don't really have a good reason. My speculation for that would be we've kind of hit the ground on Elden Ring content, and we can't really dig too much further without getting more info from the DLC, which is kind of why I've also slowed down on making Elden Ring content. That isn't to say that I don't have like a lot of ideas and things that I want to share. It's just a lot of it is really based off of speculation and conjecture, and I feel like I would be getting ahead of myself if I released a video and then it all just gets retconned, or like the record gets set straight within like the next year or whatever, whenever we get the next batch of true content. So if Elden Ring and the well of Elden Ring is running dry, people are probably going back and re-exploring the older catalog of games, and Bloodborne still kind of stands on its own 2 feet, perhaps.
Beasts all over the shop. You'll be one of them, sooner or later.
Gascoigne is a great example of the nuance and subtlety this game is able to weave into its storytelling. For many players, Gascoigne will just be another boss, a vicious, violent display of power and skill, the first of many hunter versus hunter duels to come, and a great testing ground for your ability to successfully parry with the firearm. But for those willing to dig a bit deeper, Gascoigne is one of the most tragic characters in this world, and it's possible to play witness to the demise of his entire family. As an aside, it's fascinating how much it seems like the developers were inspired by Resident Evil 4 when designing Central Yharnam. This is something I've only just noticed, as the recent Resident Evil 4 remake is the first time I've ever played the game. Stay tuned for that video, by the way, but it's all here in Central Yharnam. You round a corner to see a horde of infected villagers surrounding someone, or in this case something, being burned at a stake. Later, the chilling toll of a far-off bell seems to rouse them, and they all trudge in a trance-like state to where they need to be. Moving on to my personal favourite area in the game, Cathedral Ward is where Bloodborne really opens up. Featuring much of the same incredibly designed architecture as Central Yharnam, Cathedral Ward now soaks everything in a sinister pale light. An eerie lavender that coats the entire area and emanates from the eye-laden lanterns of the spectral wanderers that walk its streets. Here, where Central Yharnam was made up of cramped residential streets, Cathedral Ward has space to spread out, featuring enormous circular plazas adorned with statues. As the hunter arrives in the Holy Church district, the imagery here is striking. The grand cathedral and all that surrounds it still stands tall, a reminder of Yharnam's past graces, but the rot has set in.
So Beans and Rice asks, regarding Soulsborne games in general, have I checked out much regarding their frequent specific ties to Berserk? Yes, like a long time ago, but it's been a long time since I've looked at those videos, and also a very long time since I've looked at Berserk, because I wanted to wait to be able to binge a couple chapters at a time. So it's probably been like literally 10 years since I've read Berserk, and now I'll probably have like 11 chapters to read. Nah, but on a more serious note, it is very sad what happened with Mira, and I'll probably go back to Berserk at some point eventually, but it's going to be very bittersweet knowing everything now.
You get the sense that these creatures that were perhaps once men would be seen as blasphemous and unholy, particularly those garbed in black closer to the doors of the cathedral itself. The game now replaces the trademark Yharnam black brick with a material that looks more reminiscent of bleached white bone, similar to the cloaks and gowns worn by the church servants.
So just to be clear, I'm pretty sure it might have been like a Crunchy video, or maybe it was like Ratatosker. One of the videos we watched fairly recently on stream did have a big spoiler-esque section on Berserk. It was something that we watched about the Greater Will. Hold on, it was like the Greater Will, or like doesn't care about the Order, I think. So it should have been around here earlier. No, this would have been actually one of the first ones we watched. Let's see. Okay, it was Ratatosker. Wait, no, this feels like a shorter video. Maybe it was Ratatosker. But yeah, I think it was this one. Maybe I'm just misremembering. Anyway. Yeah. You wish more people did better translations of JoJo and Berserk? It's really very time consuming to look at things and know what's said in the English and then compare it to the Japanese and then understand the context of the greater work as a whole to recontextualize what is different and or why it's significant. Because some things, like the truth is, like most content, it doesn't really matter if it's not going to be like a one-to-one translation, because a lot of times things aren't so cryptic where each individual word matters a lot. So of course there's going to be some exceptions, and there's always going to be cases of like iffier localizations and translations, but generally speaking, like most things are okay. One of the weirder cases to me in like recent memory is Final Fantasy 16. Like there's a lot of the localizations that they did in that game that I think were really, really good and gave more character to the English versions of the game, or the English characters of the game, English version characters of the game. And other parts just felt a little bit lackluster in comparison to what was going on in the Japanese. And the ones that stood out to me in 16 were the things dealing with Ultima and like his motivations and telling and talking about the ego, just to keep it a little bit spoiler free / spoiler light there. Corporate Nothing never read or watched Berserk until a few months ago. You watched both good adaptations, and you're up to Deluxe Volume 9, which is crazy that that's already chapters from 2005. Sort of taking a break before you end up reading everything. Yeah. So, Howdy asks, were Maria and Gehrman just hunters and not hired? It's questionable because we don't ever get direct information about them. However, Gehrman was probably affiliated with Bergenworth at the beginning, and Maria might have been as well, and then Maria may have eventually switched allegiances and joined the Healing Church to potentially atone for her sins. Her story is really bad, quite frankly, and I wish they didn't include it the way that they did. Anyway, going back to the video.
Coils of smoke waft from incense burners left out to ward off evil spirits as massive hunched axe-wielding chapel giants lumber down majestic curved staircases, their dirtied, holy attire shredded and torn. Looming above it all is the astral clock tower, the clock face constantly emitting a sickly, baleful glow, peering down upon the Cathedral Ward and its forsaken inhabitants at all times. Cathedral Ward acts as the player's main hub in the game and their base of operations. From the Erden Chapel acting as an...
Oh yeah, so I didn't mean to like interrupt the video, but honestly I'm probably gonna like stop it here just because I can't really keep paying attention to it when it's just like all super positive. And this isn't like saying that the video is bad by any means. It's just not for me, because it's really crazy to me to get to like 40 minutes in and not even mention that, like, hey, it was a little bit annoying to farm blood vials from time to time, especially if you didn't kill Cleric Beast or Gascoigne on your first try, but that's not too big of an issue. But what I did want to say was I did remember something in, as far as like localizations, that's kind of hard to convey in the English version of Evangelion, the very first Evangelion anime, in when like I'm trying to think of if how I want to talk about this with keeping it fairly spoiler free, but also giving enough context for people who may not have watched it very recently, because it's something that I've started to rewatch only very recently, and it's just kind of something that stood out to me because it's been a very, very long time since I watched it. So I'm trying to like pay attention to what differences there are between like the fan subtitles that I'm reading and what they're actually saying. And one of the examples that stood out to me is that Rei and Shinji are going out on a mission, and Shinji tells Rei that he's afraid of dying, and then Rei tells him that, oh, he's not going to die because she'll protect him. And so that sounds like a very like loving and sweet. But there are a couple times throughout that episode when Rei says farewell to Shinji, she uses sayonara, which is obviously farewell. However, just saying farewell in English, it kind of gets across that idea a little bit, but the way that it comes across in Japanese is that it's a little bit more final and implies that there's going to be either an extended period of farewell between them, or perhaps even a permanent one. So the way that Ayanami Rei speaks is very like ethereal almost. Like the way that she speaks in Japanese, it's very clear that she's off. She's not like a contemporary of Shinji. She's not a very like normal person, which ties into like a lot of her dialogue talking about how her Eva unit is her connection, her Kizuna to everybody else in the world. So she's just very isolated, and it shows in the way she speaks, which I don't think the English can get across as strongly because of the nuance of the languages. Hey Stella, nice to see you again. Howdy says, you're confused, why does the guy say to curse the children and the children's children to Bergenworth? How would that connect to Gehrman? Because Gehrman was the canonical first hunter, and he's most likely affiliated with Bergenworth. I mean, we see Gehrman go into the fishing hamlet in the DLC trailer, if you've ever seen that. And so, with Gehrman being the first hunter, the denizens of the real fishing hamlet cursed him, so that way all hunters following Gehrman, or following since Gehrman, would kind of be cursed along with him. Even if they aren't like his literal children, they're his successors, and therefore like his metaphorical children. Stella says, Anno trying to make a creepy girl and accidentally making a whole character type. Yeah. We like to meme a little bit on Ava in the chat. All right. Okay. So I think I'll just stop this video here because he's just kind of going to talk more and more about the areas. Maybe I'll skip to the very end just to give us a little bit of closure here. Maybe not. I don't know. What about the random enemies in the Hunter's Nightmare? So, no. They're all like hunters, and they've been cursed like Gehrman has. But Gehrman's stuck in the Hunter's Dream for other reasons, so he couldn't get sucked into the Hunter's Nightmare. Although the Hunter's Nightmare and the Hunter's Dream are kind of in the exact... like, they're all in a nightmare, but they're just like different planes of it, perhaps. It's kind of hard to describe. Okay. Yeah, no, I don't feel like going through the end. So, my apologies, Mr. Tommo Talks Games. You have a very gushing video about Bloodborne. I do not doubt how much you love it, but it's just a little bit too much love for a cynical, jaded man like me. So, nonetheless, I do appreciate this video, but I'm going to move on. So next we'll move into SolePorpoise's Oh the Humanities, How Bloodborne Transforms the Myth. Right. Spoiler warning for Dark Souls and Bloodborne.
So I don't know if anyone else noticed this, but if not, I think I'm about to break some pretty big ground in video game analysis. This is after all what brought me to YouTube, to research and talk about the literary interpretations of games, and hopefully understand their true meaning. So are you ready for old SolePorpoise to blow your minds? Okay.
Yeah, he's already blown my mind by actually using light mode. Now, this is an older video, and I don't know if dark mode was really so much of a thing back then, believe it or not.
Here goes.
This one's pretty
Bloodborne
good.
Is heavily inspired by H.P. Lovecraft. Boom. Let's see here. Oh. Oh. Okay, change of plans. Let's actually talk about why that mattered.
The oldest and strongest emotion of mankind is fear, and the oldest and strongest kind of fear is fear of the unknown. The reason why I just laughed so much is because of a little bit of community lore. If you know, you know. Well, that's not cool. My computer's having issues. Okay, here we go. The deep meta lore, indeed. Is it not playing? Bruh. Okay.
Lovecraft's philosophy was that of cosmicism. Not just the idea that humans will discover aliens that they can fight should they find the right tools, but they will discover aliens that are so superior to humans that they won't even notice us. It was the idea that our species, while having value to us, is a useless coincidence. We are to these cosmic beings as ants are to us. And it's important to note that he was inspired by mythologies, so when his stories of old ones gradually turned into one, it was no surprise. His mythology, however, was different. It was used to push humans out of their human-centric worldviews, where current Christian myth kept society at the center. But where Lovecraft's invention of alien gods was revolutionary, his execution wasn't. He talked a lot about how horrible these discoveries were to characters, but he wasn't great at communicating that to the reader. Hidetaka Miyazaki, on the other hand, seems to have the tools Lovecraft needed, the understanding and ability to tell this mythology through a traditional myth. Because
Yeah, a lot of people obviously bring up H.P. Lovecraft as a reference to Bloodborne, which I do not dispute. However, I feel like they give maybe a little bit too much credit to Lovecraft for like coming up with these kind of ideas, when I think you could even look back into things like the Bible and, you know, the meme, the trope of the biblically accurate angel as kind of a thing that could have inspired Lovecraft himself. So certainly he wasn't the first to come up with these cosmologically unfathomable beings that could drive men into madness if he were to ever witness their true face at once. The milkweed rune is his initials. Yeah, a lot of people think that. I'll just leave it up to individual interpretation. Yeah, it's like saying your dot in the universe. It's not even a 1% of 1% of 1% of the rear end of the universe. True story.
viewing Bloodborne as a traditional myth is essential to understanding just how important it is as a contribution to gaming. So like peanut butter and chocolate, movies and popcorn, reading internet comments, and the overwhelming desire to stick a fork in your eye, some things just naturally complement each other. In this case, it's Lovecraftian gods and Joseph Campbell's myth. Using his understanding of the universal need for mythology, Miyazaki delivers what I'm calling the anti-myth, and in participating in it, the audience experiences the deconstruction and ultimately the destruction of the human-centered myth.
I see where they're going with this portion already. It's kind of interesting to say that it would be the anti-myth. I think it's... I mean, sure, yeah, okay. If they're using it in the sense of anti-hero, that would make sense. But otherwise, I think I would disagree, but I think I get what they're putting down. Jube thinks it's the fact that these unfathomable beings are completely uncaring and unknowable that sets Lovecraft apart from the Bible. Yeah, no, I'm not going to dispute that. I was just saying, like, even though Lovecraft did tweak the execution, it's not as though like he was the first one to think of like completely unfathomable beings. But yes, that's a good point to bring up as well.
In my first video on Dark Souls, I discussed how Miyazaki presents Joseph Campbell's idea of the hero's journey. The idea that many cultures independent of each other have a story that shares the same motifs. So Jesus, Buddha, Hercules, the chosen undead, their stories all follow similar paths. And while we're going to use Joseph Campbell as a guide again in this video, we're going to focus on the bigger picture. Because while the hero is important...
So yeah, if you guys in chat have never heard of Joseph Campbell, he's a little bit controversial because, I mean, he likes Jung and stuff, and a lot of people think that his work is a little bit too generalizing of many different peoples across the globe, which I don't necessarily disagree with, but that was kind of the goal of his work, was to find a common human element amongst all people throughout the world. And I think in a certain sense he succeeded in that, but it has definitely rubbed people the wrong way at times. And I don't really think that anything he says is like super controversial, so don't let that be the takeaway of what I'm saying. I am just trying to say that his work is deeply fascinating and deeply thought-provoking. So if you're very interested in the idea of stories and religion in general as a component of humanity, I would highly recommend checking out his work. Probably starting with The Hero with 1,000 Faces. Very fascinating stuff. He's also got like a bunch of talks on YouTube, a bunch of like interviews. He died a while back, so it's not like he's still around to like keep producing content, but what he has produced is still widely accessible for the most part. It's only an anti-myth if you take Campbell seriously. Yeah, so I think anti-myth in the sense of an anti-hero makes sense in relation to what Campbell was talking about. So I think SolePorpoise here might be onto something.
Important. They're a smaller part of a larger myth. Contained in these myths, we find defining tales that talked about our creation and the choices we make that are consequential for the rest of humanity. And when applying Joseph Campbell's research on the myth to Miyazaki's work, we find Dark Souls was written in the recognizable handwriting of the myths that came before it. For example, fire theft was a common trope of the hero's journey.
The story of Prometheus going after the fire and bringing it back and benefiting humanity and suffering for it.
I mean, Prometheus brings fire to mankind and consequently civilization. That's, by the way, a universal theme.
Oh, it is?
The hero, the fire theft theme usually with a relay race after it. It's a worldwide myth, the fire theft.
There's something symbolic in this motif of the hero's journey that resonates with us, and that's the reason we partake in a fire relay in Dark Souls. Through the game's mechanics complementing its story, we don't pass off the flame between other people, but rather, we pass the flame between ourselves.
And I think the reason for the fire theft being a kind of worldwide myth is because humans may have first truly been able to interact with fire after lightning strikes, so it really seemed as though fire was coming from the heavens, where lightning would strike the earth, leave fire and scorched earth, and then somebody would be brave enough to go where lightning had struck to collect that flame and pass it on to their the people in their surroundings, essentially. And obviously, in time, the construction of fire became more of a human technique, and so with it originating from the heavens, that might be where the idea came from, perhaps.
Or as seen through the game's mechanics, from checkpoint to checkpoint, we slowly make the same divine journey that Gwyn did to link the flame. Now before you dismiss this as useless information, and I'm sure some of you already have, this actually matters. Because as Campbell saw it, speaking through myth was a universal language that all humans could understand. And more importantly, it's more effective at transferring that message to the audience. And if we look carefully enough, we'll see the outline of the most popular creation myth in Dark Souls, when Adam and Eve ate from the tree of knowledge of good and evil.
When man had eaten of the fruit of the first tree, the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, he is said to have been expelled from the garden. He had already expelled himself from the garden. The garden is the place of unity, non-duality of male and female, non-duality of man and God, non-duality of good and evil. You eat the duality and you're on the way out. Ours is a mythology that's based on the insight of duality.
And for anybody who gets a little bit tripped up with like the face value terms of there already being a man and woman in the Garden of Eden, I think it's comparable to how there are arc trees and dragons and gray fog within the Age of Ancients. So even though they're different things, they aren't exactly products of duality and disparity, kind of similarly to what Campbell is arguing here.
And so our religion tends to be ethical in its accent. Sin and atonement, right and wrong. It started with a sin, you see.
According to the biblical myth, gained from eating from the tree of knowledge of good and evil is the knowledge of God, the knowledge to see the world in the same way that God does, through duality. And that's the reason followers of this myth are instructed to live moral lives, because a moral life is a life lived with God working through his followers. As we're going to see, the fire and the forbidden fruit share the same meaning in our creation, because both.
And obviously, simplifying things down to that degree is likely to cause some people to disagree with Campbell, which they're perfectly within their rights to do so, because it is a lot more nuanced than what is just presented right there.
Both events mark humanity's understanding of the dual nature of the world. The only difference is Dark Souls doesn't call it duality, but rather disparity.
But then there was fire. And with fire came disparity. Heat and cold. Life and death. And of course, light and dark.
So just like in the Garden of Eden, the flame brings with it duality. But along with that recognition of the dual nature of the world, both of these myths in our creation give us something else. It gives us a path to a meaningful life.
If the world is a mixture of good and evil, you do not put yourself in accord with it. You identify with the good and you fight against the evil.
It's the same thing in Dark Souls. Our purpose is to not put ourselves in accord with the dual nature of the world, but to fight for the light and against the dark. As many of you know, however, the chosen undead is offered a choice. They can either not rekindle the flame, as encouraged by Darkstalker Kath, or they can sacrifice themselves to rekindle it, and that's encouraged by Kingseeker Frampt. But if you don't trust these guys to give you a wholesome option, that might have something to do with the fact that there's a cultural distrust for serpents, because this too is reminiscent of the snake who offered Eve the forbidden fruit. Campbell notes that there's an important reason that myths commonly use snakes as a vessel for change, because to the people telling these stories, snakes are representative of the fact that they shed their skin and are reborn from what they leave behind. And that is, after all, the state of the world in Dark Souls, where the fire is fading and needs to be rekindled. But it's not the result of the choice that matters. What matters is what the choice represents. The player now sees the world in the same way that Gwyn did, and they will make their choice in the same place that Gwyn did, when he decided that he would change the world. So should the player make a dark world for humans, or a world of light and dark that the gods valued, it is the player character that will decide the fate of humanity. It's beautiful stuff, and it succeeds in its goal that all myths set out to accomplish, for the player to see God in themselves through experiencing it.
And obviously this is talking more strictly through the lens of Dark Souls 1, and not with the added context that DS2 and DS3 may provide here.
For seeing the world through a lens of duality is the same lens through which the gods view the world. Miyazaki carefully designed his myth to have the same symbolism of the myths that came before it. So even though it might have different details, we still recognize the meaning behind those details. And just as Campbell foretells, Miyazaki's version of the myth ends up contributing to a transcendental experience, because the player now feels like they have been a part of something that is much bigger than they are. As we just saw, Dark Souls is based on the same motifs as other myths. And just like other myths, humans have a role to play, one that gives them the opportunity to elevate themselves to the same level as the gods. That brings us to Bloodborne, a game that plays like Dark Souls, feels like Dark Souls, God damn it! But its story couldn't be more in contrast with that of Dark Souls, because while there are gods in Bloodborne, humanity will not elevate themselves to their level. Miyazaki will again have us experience a myth with different details, but this time when he uses the motifs, we're going to see an inversion of the meaning we would typically get from our otherwise recognizable myths. So instead of elevating us and...
Sorry, that was my fault. So I am going to kind of disagree, because I disagree with the premises that Dark Souls 1 is about taking the light and fighting the dark, but I'm also using that through the lens of having played through Dark Souls 2 and 3 especially, where it goes on to reveal that keeping things locked in a stagnant cycle causes things to decay and deteriorate and become more and more corrupt the longer they're kind of stuck as they are. So Bloodborne, I do think in many ways is very similar to Dark Souls, although Dark Souls I think is probably the bigger inverter of the myth by not giving us straightforward answers as to what the consequences of our actions entail. And because we don't know what the consequences of our actions are going to be, I feel like in some ways it's very realistic about the dilemma inherent in Dark Souls 1 and how easily somebody can be manipulated with their road to good intentions.
And allowing us to see God in ourselves, we will find the destruction of the human-centered myth. To better understand how important these events we're about to talk about are, here's a quick recap of the lore for the uninitiated. First, there was Byrgenwerth, a place of learning. A place that realized humans and the Great Ones were separate entities, and the Great Ones were far superior to humanity. Willem knew this, and while he wanted to understand them better, he was disillusioned with the limitations of humanity. So he lined his brain with eyes, and he encouraged his followers to do the same so they could someday evolve beyond the confines of humanity to better understand the Great Ones. Then, in the Chalice Dungeons, they discovered the quote-unquote holy medium. And in a schism with the college, Lawrence founded the Church, an organization that would not honor the adage of fear the old blood, and would instead imbibe it. And that brings us to the most important moment in Bloodborne's history as far as we know it, when Yharnamites attempt to brute force a relationship with the gods. Unlike other myths, Lawrence eating this forbidden fruit will not give humans the knowledge of God, but rather it will forever curse them to their bestial nature.
And to offer a counterpoint to this, I think you could compare this almost 1-to-1 with like the Tower of Babel, or Babel, however you want to pronounce it, because humans, with their arrogance, built a tower to try to reach heaven, and they were struck down, and they lost their shared universal language and became kind of barbarians to each other with their inability to communicate. Stella's failing to see how Dark Souls is about finding God in yourself. It's more like you're a pawn the whole game. It's a little bit of both. It's that you kind of need to reject what everybody else tells you what to do, and you need to decide for yourself. But to be fair, Dark Souls 1 at least, doesn't offer that kind of self-affirmation the same way that it's definitely brought up in Dark Souls 2 and kind of thrown away again in Dark Souls 3. But even then, there is a certain sense of self-affirmation and actualization to go along with it.
Master Willem, I've come to bid you farewell.
Oh, I know. You think now to betray me.
So it all started with the Chalice Dungeons, where Byrgenwerth scholars discovered the old blood, and with it, they were able to cure diseases. That's all we really know about this early time in the story, and it leaves out an important step, because
now we have been transported back into the Macalania forest in Final Fantasy X. Immediately what I think of when I hear this song.
it doesn't make sense for the Byrgenwerth scholars to use the blood, especially when there's an adage from the college that tells them not to. But it's not until we view it in its mythical context that humanity using blood to cure illness begins to make a lot more sense. For once they found it, it was not simply called the medium of blood healing, but it was called the holy medium. It's a subtle hint at the direction in which things are about to go. This leads to the creation of the church, and as you might expect, the church acts as a direct symbol for man attempting to create a relationship with the gods, in a reality that consists of them. That would be the function of any church. But notice the intentional change in the direction of the narrative. Lawrence founds the church, not a different college with different leadership, that will split off and begin using the blood. For Lawrence's followers won't be content with simply studying the Great Ones like the scholars of Byrgenwerth did. And that brings us to a surprisingly important character, Vicar Amelia, because she's going to teach us about the church and its practices when it comes to imbibing the blood. Unlike our character who imbibes the blood in the sick room and forgets about it, there's a ceremony associated with imbibing the blood for Amelia. So it's important that our encounter with her is set in the Grand Cathedral, when we find her taking part in a ritual that's intentionally barred from Catholicism, communion. To fully appreciate the significance of communion, let's look to Joseph Campbell to give this ritual context in the greater anti-myth.
One of the wonderful things in the Catholic ritual is going to communion. There you're taught that this is the body and blood of the Savior. And you take it to you, and you turn inward, and there he's working within you.
Through this context, we gain an understanding of what it means to imbibe the blood, and why this ritual came into being through the church. To partake in communion is to attempt to unify themselves with these gods, to have the blood of God pumping through their hearts. And notice the attention to detail in faithfully preserving this ritual from the Catholic myth. Should communion be taken by the hand, it should be placed in the left hand, with the right hand holding the left. And this is the same way that Amelia holds her pendant, with her right hand holding her left. Also important to the ritual is it's to be held at the same level as the heart to resemble the importance of God working through it. And this is something we notice in Vicar Amelia even when she's in her beast form, for she keeps her hand at the same level as her heart at all moments she is able. This is all to say that Bloodborne doesn't clumsily use communion by analogy and then turn it into their version of it. Instead, it's careful to preserve everything it can from the ritual to show its importance. It's respectful of the ceremony and what it means to the context of the myth.
So this is kind of funny because I agree and disagree, and part of the reason why I disagree is because I do think they take that idea of communion and turn it into their own thing, with the blood of the healing blood, the old blood, not necessarily being connected to God or the gods or the great ones, but more or less the power of it coming through the collective unconsciousness of the dead, which, you know, might go on to be like the main source of divinity in this world. We don't exactly know for sure, but anyway, I do appreciate these observations here quite a bit.
Because communion is Catholicism's way of becoming unified with God. Having these gods work through us through imbibing the blood is even presented in the box art. For we see a character in the Hunter set with a crimson color that resembles angel wings, but these are red and thus granted through blood. It shows us that the blood is our key to accessing the divine transformation that will be a part of this myth. It's a symbol that's paralleled in Amelia's transformation, because the shot that focuses on her silhouette doesn't show her claws or her teeth transform first. It shows her upper back, the same place these wings are located, and it erupts with blood. It's similar to the wings of blood that spew from the backs of the amygdalas, and it represents our transition into this divine plane. Communion with the Great One.
So I think he's kind of right here, but he's also missing half of the equation, because when you do look at the box art, not only is there blood, there are these shadowy claws that come out along with it. So the one thing that I've constantly said about Bloodborne and the blood in Bloodborne is that it's both holy and profane, in that it's holy because the divine power of the spirit is like holy adjacent because it's divine, and profane because consuming this blood is essentially consuming your brethren, which is cannibalism, which is a taboo that doesn't really need any form of introduction. And consuming your brethren and their souls kind of condemns them and damns them if what you do goes to waste. So you kind of inherit their will, their desire, their blood echoes to continue on and fulfill their undisclosed wishes. And in so doing, you're kind of corrupting yourself in the process and potentially leading to your own downfall as well.
And it erupts with blood. It's similar to the wings of blood that spew from the backs of the amygdalas, and it represents our transition into this divine plane. Communion with the Great Ones marks an important inversion of a typical myth. In any other myth, including the very one Bloodborne borrowed the ritual from, humanity plays a role in which they can become one with God. Instead, there's a clear cost associated with this gesture. Humans become not invigorated, but sick, and are doomed to succumb to their bestial nature that lurks inside them. And it's from this moment that the rest of the events of Bloodborne unfold. Because now Yharnam is stuck in a seemingly endless cycle of its citizens turning into beasts, and hunters who hunt them. Humans will go on to try different methods to make themselves relevant in a world of gods, but all of them will fail.
Oh, I'm nauseous. Have you felt this? It's progressing. I can see things. I knew it. I'm different. I'm no beast. Oh, God, it feels awful. But it proves that I'm chosen.
This is ultimately the main idea behind Bloodborne. In a world...
So I am a little bit curious about how they feel about the slug ending, and that's kind of one thing that I think keeps me at bay from fully being on board with this interpretation of events here.
World of gods, humans naturally see themselves as a part of that higher plane of existence, and be it through meditation, communion, or some other means, humans will try some method to gain entry. But Bloodborne inverts that, and not just for our myth, but also for the expectations from the player. And to better understand that, we need to look no further than Bloodborne's inverted hero's journey. Let's start this section with a quick distinction. Where the myth is focused on the things that we experience from the external, the hero's journey within the myth is focused on the things that we experience from the inside. Therefore, the myth is about God and how he affects us, and the hero's journey is about how humans can have a spiritual transformation from within, where they overcome their egos, thereby taking on traits that resemble the traits of God. But as we've already discussed, humanity seems to be barred from entering this godly realm in Bloodborne, and that's what we're going to experience in this corrupted version. of the hero's journey. So just like we did in the video on Dark Souls, we're going to apply the steps of the hero's journey to the game, and see how Miyazaki merges the meaning of those steps with the game's mechanics so that the player can more directly experience them. But this time, instead of the player using the journey to uplift themselves to the plane of the gods, we're going to see how this corrupted version of the hero's journey makes the player feel dejected through experiencing the limitations of humanity. Now, in the beginning act of Bloodborne, things are fairly normal from the perspective of the hero's journey, and the first 3 steps all seem to come at once. The first is the ordinary world, and while we don't see it, we have an idea of what that ordinary world was for our character from the stats select screen that tells us our history, and we have our call to adventure, which is our contract that obligates us to carrying out the hunt. These 2 steps can't really be inverted because they affect the character and thereby the player's motivation. So there's not much to work with here since Bloodborne can't tell its story if the player isn't motivated to carry it out. So let's move on to the next step, the meeting with the mentor. In Dark Souls, this was the meeting with Oscar, who gives us the divine gift of the Estus Flask, and it was the step that was so important to Dark Souls' hero's journey that I talked about it ad nauseum in my last video. In Bloodborne, the blood vials serve the same purpose as a healing mechanic and as a divine gift. It's the sole reason we're able to get through the game because it teaches us how to navigate the game's exceptionally dangerous world through trial and error. And it's an item we rely on throughout the game, beginning to end, that gives us a psychological boost so that we know that we're making progress. But our mentor here, the Blood Minister, is a little bit more of a sketchy character than Oscar was. And while his sketchiness isn't immediately clear, there's good reason for us to be suspicious. Because while we need the blood to cure us of our illness, it causes the player to willingly inject themselves with the very thing that has turned men into beasts. And this is
I do feel like it's a little bit arguable to say what the mentor role in Bloodborne is, because Eileen is optional and she certainly plays a mentor role in the beginning. But if not Eileen, I would almost argue that Gascoigne serves that hunter role by literally being a role model of what a hunter is and what a hunter could be if they pursue the path too long.
The brilliance of Miyazaki. Just like in Dark Souls, he is able to use the game's mechanics as a metaphor, for the blood also devolves the player into beasts. The first thing you might notice about the blood vials when comparing it to the Estus Flask is it reverts to the more flawed system that forces us to waste time farming vials. Now, can players make it through the whole game without making an effort to restock their supply of blood vials? Absolutely. Will they? Not likely unless they're trying to prove a point that they're better than me. What was probably the typical experience for the naive Bloodborne player was they had to farm blood vials one way or another. For me, it was a route in central Yharnam. Many other players likely had a different route or method that they felt was a reliable way to get blood vials, but there was likely never any serious number crunching on what was the best method. Instead, we felt a certain path was the best because it was the one that worked for us before. There's a reason for this. There's a part of our brains that's carried over from our animal origins. It's the part that associates locations with certain stimuli. That's the reason why we think of our farming location as a good one. It's our animal brain telling us that we're in the right place because it knows it's paid off before. And if you felt uneasy traversing the world with your blood vials lower than the max amount, that was our animal brains telling us we're breaking from our proven ritual. It knows that we can and should be more prepared, and even though we rarely use all our blood vials when exploring the world, we're still creating an unnecessary risk. Both of these things can be attributed to that same primitive animal part of the brain that also shares its name with one of the great ones, the amygdala. It's an important clue because this is...
So, Beans and Rice says that they think Gehrman is the mentor, and Gehrman still inverts that trope. I could see that for sure because he kind of does set us on the path that we need to follow to a certain degree. You could also like fight him and he goes away, but I do think Papa G might be the better mentor figure because he directly teaches the player like how to fight, if for no other reason than you're forced to fight him, and he does exemplify what like the typical or prototypical hunter should be, perhaps. Which isn't to say like Gehrman doesn't eventually towards the end of the game, but at the very least in the beginning, you don't have a lot of direct role models teaching you how to go through combat because you only talk to Eileen, you only talk to Gehrman, but you do get that kind of physical introduction through Papa G. He's also an outsider like the PC, true.
Its name with one of the great ones, the amygdala. It's an important clue because this is also the part of the brain that recognizes what we should be afraid of, and we're going to see a lot more on fear and how that also affects the player's animal brain in the upcoming steps. For now, just note that the narrative about men turning into beasts after consuming the blood works in more ways than just the story. It's a direct commentary that keeps cropping up in the game, be it from the hunter tools that acknowledge the primitive parts of men, or the runes that tell humans of this world to be leery of the horrific and unwelcome bestial instinct deep within our hearts. It all combines to say that the human brain is an animal brain, and by being forced to farm the blood vials in this ritualistic way, we too are giving into our animal nature. Our next important step in the journey is something that Campbell points out to be a motif in modern myths, the bar scene. Here, the hero is just about to cross the first threshold and begin their initiation process. It's where they encounter the characters who have already experienced the special world, and it serves to contrast the hero's inexperience.
10,000? We'd almost buy our own ship for that.
But who's gonna fly it, kid? You?
You bet I could. I'm not such a bad pilot myself. I'm not going to sit here and listen.
It's a taste of what's to come when they experience the outside world for themselves. In Dark Souls, it's Firelink Shrine, a safe place that's just on the border of the special world. It's here the player will run into NPCs who will offer him or her advice on how to navigate Lordran, as well as sell them spells and miracles they've already learned. And each time we encounter an NPC who we send back to Firelink Shrine, they automatically know where to go. It's well known as a haven in this dangerous world. In Bloodborne, things are different. The equivalent to the bar scene comes after the first mandatory boss, Gascoigne, Odin Chapel. Here there are incense that ward off the beasts that make it a safe space. But where the warriors and seasoned veterans of the special world should inhabit the bar like in Dark Souls, we instead find people who know less about the special world than you do. Instead of knowing where to go like in Dark Souls, they ask you where to go.
Perhaps it isn't my place to ask, but do you know somewhere that might take me in?
But the player likely doesn't have an informed answer on their first playthrough. They're given a choice where they can send them to Eosefka's clinic, Odin Chapel, or nowhere at all. In this sense, the player is just as informed as the NPCs looking for a good answer are, and giving them the wrong answer, as we know, will make them subject to imposter Eosefka's weird experiments. So there's a lot at stake if our intention is for them to survive. So the value of the bar scene isn't just an obscure reference that we're meant to pick up on should we do the research. There's a reason this interaction from the hero's journey exists, and why it's inverted, so the player will feel a sense of loneliness and despair. After I defeated Rom and revealed the real terror behind the events of the game, it was the first time I desperately wanted to talk to the NPCs. I longed for them to tell me that this was a normal part of the hunt, because discovering the first amygdala wasn't just a weird out-of-place allusion to what's going to happen later in the story. Now they were everywhere. It made me feel discomfited, and I wanted to know that someone else had seen it before. Instead, the refugees of Odin Chapel were beset by a psychological decline much worse than mine.
Oh, there's something wrong with me.
They were less prepared for this than the naive player was, and so the player is alone in what is the game's true special world.
So Jube says this is kind of cherry picking though, and that once they get to Campbell's bar, they know much more than the players. So yeah, I see what you're saying there, and you could also make the argument that like Eileen is kind of like the equivalent of Han Solo, where she's a seasoned veteran who knows more about the world, and she just kind of like laughs at the good hunter's naivete, perhaps, especially if they seem as though they're scared of beasts in Eileen's mind. But nonetheless, I do kind of understand where SolePorpoise is coming from and saying this is kind of an inversion where the hero has to go out and collect others to go to the bar, but I don't necessarily think that's fully accurate, just because it's not as though this is the first myth or story told which has like the protagonist going out and collecting party members to meet up or meet again later where they'll get like more useful information. I don't know.
And Odin Chapel brings us to the next extremely important step in this hero's journey, the meeting with the goddess. This is a step where the hero experiences love, and that love can be romantic or maternal. So let's look at Ariana, because she offers us an inversion of both romantic and maternal love. As for her romantic love, what we should expect is a scene like what we get in The Lion King, where Nala gives Simba that very inappropriate fuck me face. But instead of true love, Ariana is a lady of the night. So rather than helping us understand what love is...
I'm off during hunt, so if that's what you're here for, I'll leave you to your own devices. If that doesn't do it, come back in the morning, darling.
She offers us a shallow and unfulfilling pleasure. So what about maternal love? For that, we look to her motherhood. Now, it's not a new idea to have a character impregnated by aliens.
So Jupe says, as an English major, you're so tired of people comparing works to Hero with 1,000 Faces. Well, let's be real here. Those comparisons will never end because Hero with 1,000 Faces is literally designed to be compatible with any form of storytelling. Like, that's the whole thesis of it. So you'll just have to accept the grave that's already been dug for you by Joseph Campbell. But yeah, I do understand where you're coming from with that. Like, I like Hero with 1,000 Faces and Campbell just because of it being a pioneer work in kind of trying to tap into that collective unconsciousness, that kind of pseudo monomyth that is consistent between all cultures and religions. And I do think it's very admirable in what it set out to do there. But certainly, I would agree that it is a little bit too ubiquitous in nature, and people can impress upon that idea whatever they want due to the very nature of that idea to begin with. And so, to tie that back into this right here, I don't know if comparing Ariana and her love to the storied love interest of Campbell is necessarily fair when there are other characters like Queen Annalise with whom the player can propose marriage to directly and get turned down. But I don't think that's strictly necessary, that you need to have the whole love trope interest to begin with anyway, which might go against the whole idea that Campbell initially posits.
But being impregnated by alien gods is a unique one. And because this is in the context of a myth and already borrows so heavily from Catholicism, there's...
Yeah, let me back that up, because I want to say, if you consider the Christian God an alien, I don't necessarily think that's too much of a stretch. And obviously that might be a bit of a strong statement, but just thinking about it, a god beyond the world isn't that different from a great one impregnating a woman, except for the whole aspect of motive.
Impregnated by aliens, but being impregnated by alien gods is a unique one. And because this isn't...
Yeah, so saying alien gods, I feel is doing a lot of heavy lifting in that sentence there.
In the context of a myth, and already borrows so heavily from Catholicism, there seems to be a lot in this story that resembles the virgin birth that takes place in the New Testament. That's because the virgin birth is a common motif of the myth.
This is the virgin birth. It's the birth of spiritual man out of the animal man.
But in these stories, that's the moment when gods are born.
And you know who that God is? It's you. It's not a physical birth. It's symbolic of a spiritual transformation. That's what the virgin birth's about.
As we know, Ariana is impregnated by a great one, and that on its own elevates her to the goddess status. But also contained in her story is the fact that she was impregnated without touch, just like the Virgin Mary, for it was initiated by the Great One without a physical form, Odin. But as you...
Hey Knucklehead, nice to see you again. Is your wife's name actually Annalise, or are you just making a Bloodborne reference? It's a little bit difficult to tell with text. And if so, happy anniversary.
You'd expect, the story of the virgin birth is inverted. It's not virginity that makes Ariana special. Instead, the one who's associated with virginity, the nun, is ignored, and Odin impregnates the whore with special blood. Instead of being told that she would be the mother to God before he impregnated her, like Mary was, Odin surreptitiously impregnates Ariana. Lastly, Ariana doesn't take her baby to a manger like Mary did, but rather she takes it to the gutters. All these inversions when taken together matter because this is where the audience is supposed to feel the most incontrovertibly beautiful thing about being human, to experience love. But here, Ariana doesn't love her child, but rather she is horrified by it. And for me, this is one of the most horrific events I've witnessed in gaming.
So yeah, this ties into a couple things. Ironically, I don't think the sewers here are that much different from a manger, because a manger isn't exactly where people take up residence. But of course, like, times are very, 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 very different in biblical times. And being offered hospitality at somebody's manger wasn't terribly uncommon here. But for what it's worth, even though Ariana does initially say that her baby is a nightmare, she does have a bit of special dialogue if you imbibe 3 of her, what were they called? Her blood vials throughout the game, or 4 of them. And she can say something else if you reload the area.
I've never been happier.
So yes, she does say it is a nightmare initially, but if you do go through that route of getting her special dialogue, she does say she's never been happier, which is, of course, is very suspect in the way she delivers that line with her kind of maniacal laughter shortly following it. You were joking about Queen Annalise. Okay, thought so. Folklorists love to tear Campbell apart. It's very fun. Scaleezy says, this sounds very based in Abrahamic religion. You don't know if other religions have virgin births as well. More criticizing Campbell than Bloodborne here. So it's a little bit of both. There are ideas of virgin birth throughout different cultures, but obviously the Abrahamic religion has it as a very big focal point of that religion. And I know one religion that it's often compared to is Zoroastrianism, with Mithra being the product of a virgin birth as well. Yeah, I still actually need to watch Brotherhood of the Wolf. I thought about doing that for like a community video night on the Discord, and I just never got around to it. I would need to get like an extra HDMI cable and like actually get the movie and all this other stuff. So yeah, so aesthetics from Brotherhood of the Wolf were definitely lifted into Bloodborne. But yeah, now that you mention it, I don't think anyone has made like a deep dive into the video, and that might also just be due to people not knowing about it, or the movie itself potentially not being that great, and or like copyright concerns. Who knows?
But it's not for shock value, but rather it's to expose our human weakness. That's the importance of this inverted step. We don't see this virgin birth as a metaphor for spiritual transformation without physical touch, like Campbell talks about. Instead, we simply experience horror.
It can't be. This is a nightmare.
Later, we have atonement with the Father, who isn't necessarily restricted to being our Father, but rather a figure with immense power. In Bloodborne, that would be the Moon Presence. Lastly, there's Apotheosis, which is a spiritual transformation, but more on these last 2 steps later. For now, just note, all these inversions matter when taken together to contribute to the hero's journey because, as I've already said, they don't work to uplift us, but rather, they work to give us experiences and emotions that are unique to humanity. But these experiences and emotions reveal our weakness. And while these are important, there's one step in particular that stands out.
Yeah, I was just about to ask, did I miss something, or if they didn't talk about this one? Okay.
Because there's a moment in the game where we engage in what should be the most pivotal part of the journey, where the hero confronts and conquers the Abyss. This act is going to mirror the step in the hero's journey referred to by Campbell as the belly of the whale. It's where the hero appears to have died, and that's important because it symbolizes the fact that the hero has to shed an aspect of themselves that's holding them back so they can become fully prepared for what's to come. And that's exactly what we get from the Snatcher. Because unlike every other fight in the game, if we fail, we don't return to our last lantern, but rather we're abducted and taken to the alien world of Hypogean Goal, where we're seemingly trapped. And as we're going...
Yeah, I would definitely disagree with this, because this is completely optional, and obviously, even though it is part of Bloodborne's story, I don't know if it's necessarily fair to include it, but by the same token, I don't know if it's fair to disclude it. But either way, my initial impression of what I believe would have fit into the whole idea of the belly of the whale would be entering the corpse of Mikolash and being transported into Though being transported into either the lecture hall or the Nightmare of Mentis, essentially.
To see, Bloodborne uses horror more effectively than ever before to make this step better translate to the player. This scene marks some of the most sophisticated design choices in the horror game genre, because one of its tools is to show the larger system that governs the rules of the story can be broken. A great example of this is in PT, a game that, at its core, is a puzzle game, so the player is reliant on carrying over the same rules of reality that govern their life and the laws of logic that help them navigate it. This is why PT is so effective at what it does. Logic is essential for solving these reality-based puzzles, but we can't rely on it because reality breaks down. Minutes tick backwards, hallways go on forever, and fourth walls are broken. This all works together to transfer a feeling of powerlessness to the player, to make them understand that they're at the mercy of a system that's more powerful than they are. And that brings us to Yahar Ghul. Here we have no choice but to face this challenge. If you try to die or use the Hunter's Mark to force the game to take you back to your last save, it will force you to return to the jail cell instead.
Which is ironic because this is all technically optional here.
Here the system as we knew it has broken down. We are no longer able to exploit this system because it anticipates us trying to override it. It's the equivalent of the PS4 telling us,
"I'm sorry, Dave. I'm afraid I can't do that."
This is important because just like how understanding reality is essential to overcoming the challenges in PT, but reality starts to break down, our inability to force the game into letting us back to the hunter's dream offers us the same feeling of powerlessness. Because instead of...
And if not like going into the lecture hall, you could make the argument obviously that defeating Ram is very much akin to jumping into the belly of the whale, because you're literally jumping into the ocean and fighting an aquatic creature.
Of our understanding of reality being our tool for success. In Bloodborne, it's our opportunity to upgrade our stats and gear, but now we're prohibited from doing this until we escape. In Souls games, the player has always been in a situation where they can decide whether or not they are strong enough to continue fighting in a certain area. This is the hallmark of the series, but here we're stuck until we get ourselves out. And this impacts the challenge of the area substantially. Now we have a constant reminder that we're likely outclassed, and our fight or flight instinct is putting more pressure on the flight side. This gives us a nagging feeling of doubt in our abilities, because it disarms us of our key to our strength. It's like when Dumbo lost his feather and had to realize that his ability to fly came from within. This feeling of doubt heavily influences our decisions. And that leads us to the second reason this area is brilliantly designed. Because in addition to making us doubt our ability to handle this challenge, Bloodborne takes advantage of another tool of the horror game genre, to charge the player with multiple, meaningful decisions. Since we are abducted and taken to the center of the dungeon, we have no reliable way to know how to escape. And what's more is we're at the bottom level of a three-dimensional labyrinth. Upon arriving, we can go left, right, upstairs, which lead to more stairs, both up and down, which all lead to new areas on their own. And every time we reveal a new corridor or stairwell, we're also revealing a new risk. Will the path we choose reveal the exit or bring us deeper into the dungeon? This is all extremely important to the overall experience because the emotional weight of our decisions, and the vast amount of them, contribute to one of the most anxiety-inducing, adrenaline-pumping, and all-out terrifying experiences I've had in gaming. And it might be tempting to classify this scene as just another unfair, cheap way to frustrate the player like Souls games to be known for. But this was an extremely important moment in the context of the hero's journey, because the belly of the whale scene that we get here was followed faithfully. It's usually a scene where the hero is taken prisoner or is otherwise trapped against their will. It's a scene where they appear to have died and returned from the abyss. It's a scene where they shed a weaker part of themselves so they can take on the more demanding challenges of the special world.
And I mean, you might even be able to compare that idea to being stuck in the hunter's dream and being unable to return to the waking world until you, quote unquote, stop the spreading scourge, or stop the source of the spreading scourge of beasts.
And that's why this scene is so notable in Bloodborne, because in addition to the character on screen experiencing each of these moments, by delivering this scene through horror, Miyazaki is able to directly communicate this feeling of self-overcoming to the player. For players will overcome that animal part of them that's screaming for them to be terrified of every new danger. But this isn't all that's important about this scene, because as we know, this is the inverted hero's journey. So just like with every other step we've talked about at length, instead of being uplifted by this, we're going to experience demoralization. because what Bloodborne giveth, Bloodborne taketh away. As we know, we return to Yahar Ghul, and this time we find our participation in one of the most powerful acts in the game turns out to have been a trick. When entering from the normal entrance, we find this area is transformed. While this should be a moment where the hero returns to conquered ground, they instead find the layout has changed with new and more difficult enemies. But more important than this is the fact that defeating Rom revealed something new to the player that was likely present during our jailbreak. Now we can see the amygdalas who look down on us from high above, unable to be conquered and likely unconcerned with our existence.
So yeah, Knucklehead asks, is there any other good ROM info that was lost in translation or localization? I don't know how familiar you are with my channel, but my really big magnum opus episode of Fear the Old Lore, the Bloodborne True Story Lost in Translation video, does go into a lot of detail about Rom's role and what was lost in translation with her.
And upon having that creepy realization that I was being watched during my desperate fight for survival after being kidnapped, I felt instantly dejected. Here, every one of my decisions mattered to me, and upon conquering the abyss, I felt I had conquered something deep within myself that would give me the tools to take on the challenges in the rest of the game. But that wasn't what was happening. These amygdalas didn't intervene, and probably didn't care about any of my decisions that felt so important to me at the time. This was the point Lovecraft was trying to make. For my actions are human actions, and those have no impact on the universe, even if they're the actions of a hero. And with this, I felt nostalgic for the much more difficult, much more terrifying experience of my jailbreak, a time before I had the insight that revealed the amygdalas. Because even though I was in an alien world, legitimately confused and frightened, at least at that moment, the story was about me. Unlike other myths, the most pivotal moment for the hero in the myth didn't help the hero to save the world. It made me realize how insignificant I was. Players participate in the hero's journey because they anticipate they will find themselves at the center of the myth, but players in Bloodborne gain no such insight. Instead, we have done the equivalent of imbibing the forbidden blood. In participating in this version of the hero's journey, we went in thinking humans would conquer this world and unite ourselves with some aspect of God. Instead, we discovered that we're nothing more than sophisticated beasts with good intentions.
He died with his ideals untarnished. He was a true hero, and earned that much at least.
So obviously, I do think that is a bit of a limited, forced perspective in that it might overlook the significance of the third ending where the player turns into the slug, essentially. But moving on from that, Jube says, they don't think there are even any heroes in Lovecraft, even feudal heroes screaming into the void. Yeah, I guess if you want to call them heroes, you might be right, but hero is in many ways synonymous with protagonist, which is kind of ironic coming from me with my username here, but yeah. Even if they aren't necessarily heroic, they can still be protagonists. But even with that being said, in Lovecraft's stories, the protagonists don't really, how do I say it? They don't really provide a lot of commentary on themselves or humanity, or they don't go through a transformation and learn from their experiences. Typically, they just kind of act as vehicles to progress Lovecraft's stories, which I think is kind of an inversion of the typical trope of a story where there's, a moral to things, perhaps, whether or not it be an intended moral or something people pick up incidentally for themselves or interpret for themselves. Yeah, Lovecraft's protagonists are just kind of incidental, which I think goes along with that whole otherness of the Great Ones, or the Dream Realms and things of that nature, which are very uncaring towards humanity. Yeah, protagonist just means main character. Heroes of Despair and Madness. They just discovered philosophical nihilism. Good for them. Yeah. Alright, going back to the video. The meaning of
it's
the
important
anti-myth.
to note that Campbell doesn't take any of these motifs of the myth literally. To him, they're all metaphors that offer a path for humans to become better than their bestial instincts and put themselves in touch with the better parts of their nature. That's why Bloodborne functions so well at what it does. We don't need to have researched Joseph Campbell to feel the universal message of a myth and become elevated. In the same way, we don't need to have researched Joseph Campbell to feel the universal message of Bloodborne, that humans will have multiple futile attempts to see the gods in themselves, but will ultimately succumb to their animal nature. This was the point Lovecraft was trying to make. These gods don't exist for humanity. They exist with no concern for humanity. The myth is Miyazaki's tool to make us truly feel this way, because it's universally about us and our place in the universe. It's about us and our destiny to inherit the earth. But here, Miyazaki uses it to point out that even at our greatest, we are but ants to these gods. But there's another option that completes this anti-myth. Should we follow the instructions at the School of Men's lecture building and use 3/3 chords, we will ascend after defeating the moon presence. The player character's ascension is marked by another virgin birth, this time to the doll of the dream who instantly nurtures the player character in their vulnerable state. But it's not to a human that will use its humanity to ascend to godhood like Campbell talked about. It's to an infant alien god who has ascended through shedding its humanity. We have completed the hero's journey and bared witness to another virgin birth, but we cannot understand this metaphor of spiritual transformation because these gods are not for humans, so players are trapped on this human plane, likely feeling confused and unsettled by what we're seeing. Because as Willem puts it,
our eyes are yet to open.
The quote-unquote true ending of Bloodborne shows our hero ascend to godhood, but without the player. The player is trapped on this plane, unable to see themselves in this virgin birth. This is how Miyazaki delivers the Lovecraftian mythos in a way that Lovecraft himself would have envied. By using Campbell's research on the myth as well as the game's mechanics, Miyazaki presents to us the anti-myth that directly affects the player.
So I agree with certain portions of this, and I disagree with others, which doesn't really say a lot on its own, I understand. However, the way that I typically look at Bloodborne, and especially its third ending, is that this whole idea that humanity is consumed of evolution into the next step, the thing beyond humanity, what does that actually mean? And I feel like it's kind of like the curling of the monkey paw, where like you make a wish that you want to ascend the beastly idiocy of man, but you don't exactly know what that means. You're just focused on evolution, enlightenment. But if you need to gain enlightenment, if you need to transcend humanity to gain enlightenment, what does that mean? That might mean you need to leave your humanity behind. And so I think that is a very fascinating aspect that we kind of overlook in the pursuit of knowledge as a collective whole, generally. And it does fit in with a lot of like Lovecraftian tropes and even like greater science fiction tropes of humanity's greater place in the universe, especially as time marches on. Because eventually humans will no longer exist the way that we see them. Will either evolve like physically, mentally, socially, whatever. And if that were to happen, does the collective aspect that we consider ourselves human by disappear, or will it kind of evolve into another form as well? And if it does, will that kind of evolved form of humanity be recognizable to us, which I think is a big component of a lot of people's disgust at the third ending, because they see a slug which should essentially represent potentially the best of humanity being evolved into the next form of humanity, but our animalistic reaction to this is to just kind of recoil in disgust and terror or whatever, what have you. You're not no ant, you're a slug with tentacles? That's you? Yeah. Man's cursed to get as close to God and then become one. Discard flesh, become enlightened being. Find out it's lame, come back to New Game Plus. Yeah. And maybe that's a power we'll get upon attaining that divinity. The oh so coveted respawn point.
So while this is a story about gods, and this is a story about humans, this is not a story about humans participating in a myth. Bloodborne denies us the ability to see ourselves in God and instead offers us a story where we see ourselves for the beasts that we really are.
So yeah, I would disagree that we would see ourselves as the beasts that we really are, because I think that just shows more of a base animalistic nature of humanity. But that's a big caveat. There's a big caveat in that the base animalistic part of ourselves is the part that we can already recognize as being base and animalistic. But then what comes to the next point when we transform or transcend humanity and look back at where we are now? Maybe we're all beasts, kind of as SolePorpoise is alluding to, but I don't think that's quite what they were setting up there.
Isn't dead. So sorry about the wait for this video, but if you haven't already, make sure to subscribe and you can see my next video in no more than 8 months. Jesus, you guys are way too kind. Thank you for your patience. I'll do my best to avoid this happening again. Until then, thanks for watching and I'll see you guys next time.
So yeah, even though I have a lot of disagreements with this video, I think it was fun, had a lot of interesting ideas. And so I'm going to go ahead and share the video and chat with you guys now if you want to give it a like and or give SolePorpoise a sub yourselves. So, right. Okay. I don't think I have too much else to say about that, so I'll need to figure out what else we should watch with the little bit of time that we have left. So, if possible, it'd be cool to do something related to Bloodborne, but I don't think I have anything left on the playlist related to Bloodborne. So, okay, this one with Max Duratz, Sekiro and Elden Ring, an undiscovered, mind-blowing connection. Could be interesting, because I actually haven't really looked at anything related to Sekiro on this channel, I don't think. Of course, like, the topics come up incidentally, but, oh well. Alright. Sekiro and Elden Ring, an undiscovered, mind-blowing connection by Max Duratz.
When I have covered Japanese games, my analysis has sometimes been criticized as Eurocentric, that I too often try to justify how Western mythological concepts influenced a Japanese game without looking at the Eastern influences. I think there are two ways of looking at this criticism. On the one hand, just because a game is made primarily by people of Japanese origin, that doesn't negate Western influence. I think it's self-evident when you look at Japanese games like Silent Hill, or Nier Automata, or Xenogears, that Western mythological and philosophical ideas took precedence. On the other hand, I will admit, I probably have been denying myself certain discoveries by ignoring Eastern traditions. For the last...
And that's kind of one of those things where you don't know that you don't know, and so even though like those criticisms might be sort of valid against Max here, I don't necessarily blame him, because I can't necessarily expect everybody to know everything about everything. And so with that being said, I do think it is still perfectly valid to look at a piece of Eastern literature or art or what have you with a Western lens, because that is a lens that is going to be held in common with people from the West. There is that whole argument to be made about the death of the author, where once their work is finished and goes out into the public at large, that their input over that piece of work becomes largely irrelevant in the eye of the beholder. So, for instance, even though like Miyazaki talks a lot in interviews about like the lore and things of the games which aren't in the game, the final build of the game, we can't reasonably expect people to know about what he's talking about, or even assume that what he says is representative of the final build of the game. So maybe a more tangible example of that would be how J.K. Rowling has often capitulated to ideas of like more diversity in the characters of her books, which weren't present within the works directly themselves. So for example, she said Dumbledore was gay, and while that could be perfectly true and all that, that's not something that was very readily noticeable from her first set of books directly, and it was just kind of built upon more later. And then, of course, like a child asked her if there was ever like a Jewish wizard, and she said yes, which is fine. But we never got like any indications of those in like the world of Harry Potter. And I think it becomes like a really weird exercise to think of like, well, if there's a Jewish wizard, are there like Jews who believed in like the Abrahamic religions, or are there Christians? Was Jesus a wizard? It kind of becomes a big melting pot of controversies waiting to happen when authors kind of make those kind of capitulations to appease some of their fan base, rather than just shutting their mouths and letting fans think what they want to think. So death of the author can be valid, and of course, for a lot of people, it does seem a bit unfair to say that the author of a piece of work shouldn't have any say about how it's interpreted after the fact. So definitely a lot of room for criticism about the death of the author, as well as a lot of room for validity to be held within it, perhaps. It doesn't affect the Harry Potter books at all. Yeah, and that's kind of what I was saying. Like, I personally don't care if Dumbledore is gay or not. The issue to me is like it has no relevance to the books. Like, it doesn't help characterize him any specific ways, I don't think. I mean, I'm sure people would argue against it, but and to be fair, it's not as though like anybody's sexuality has to inform what you feel about them, but it just by and large didn't really matter to me. Clownscum says, as a queer person, she's literally only saying that stuff to make her look good, and it means nothing to you. Yeah, that's kind of the vibe that I got from it, but of course she did expand upon it a bit more with like the Grindelwald stuff. I'm not too familiar with it, and she's, got her own problems like going beyond that. But that's just kind of like one example that I can think of, like death of the author, where like it's very it's very clear that the author is talking out of her ass. Whereas I can't think of like another one quite as easily as her. They did milk a movie out of it with Grindelwald. Stella says, it really depends on the game. A Western lens on Bloodborne or Dark Souls is not the same as if you went Eurocentric on a game like Alchemy. True, and that's a very fair comment as well. But I do think even with that being said, that it is perfectly valid and acceptable to only work with a Western lens with Okami. But with that being said, I do think there is a lot of things that can be lost in translation, metaphorically speaking there, and maybe even literally. Astanek says, the problem with Rowling is that you honestly think she had a firm image and was willing to change it to appease an audience. Yeah, I don't really know. Like, in some ways, like, Gandalf read as being more asexual to me than either, like, queer or straight. Like, his sexuality didn't have any bearing on my understanding of the story, and he just seemed more like a platonic character than anything else. But of course, that's probably a bit unfair, because he's more of a grandfatherly figure, and, yeah, I don't feel like getting too far into that. Yeah, retroactively adding in those things don't change the story or characters at all is poor writing. So with that being said, is there a case of like death of the author, which the opposite is true, where like the author expanding on something makes things make more sense? I'm certain there's like a lot of them out there. Miyazaki is a good example with the whole like pale blood thing, or like the great ones losing their children is a byproduct of them being like super evolved. And it's an idea that came readily to him because the more advanced a society is, like the lower the birth rate. So that to me is a case of like, oh man, this really makes a lot of sense. I really do think it impacts my understanding of the story and the great ones and all that. Did I say Gandalf? I probably did. Gandalf the gay. So yeah, Gandalf, Dumbledore, same character, right? Both Ian McKellen. That is sarcasm. All right. Anyway, going back to the video.
2 weeks. I've been trying to rectify this injustice by looking to games and books that focus on Eastern ideas. And today, I continue to showcase the fruit of my efforts with Sekiro: Shadows Die Twice. Full disclosure.
Ooh, I feel like this is going to be a bit rough just because I feel like it's going to be a very, very tall order to get a proper understanding of like the East through things from the very like little bit that he showed us with like what a thumbnail of like Yu-Gi-Oh and Persona 3 or Shin Megami Tensei 3 rather. I guess these are his videos. So maybe he did a lot more research than this, I assume, but yeah, it's good luck to him is what I'll say.
Disclosure, Sekiro is the one major Souls type game that I haven't finished. This is primarily because I've been told by a lot of people that while the gameplay is state of the art, and it is, the game didn't have a story that cries out for analysis to the same degree that Dark Souls and Bloodborne did. Still, I figured if there were any hints regarding the influence of Eastern myths on the developers, it might be worthwhile to spend a couple of hours playing Sekiro. Simultaneously, I thought it would be a good idea to look at books on Eastern alchemy, given that the other From Software games are filled to the alembic's brim with alchemical influence. In doing this, I uncovered something unbelievably brilliant about Sekiro's primary healing item, the gourd. Not only did I uncover the mythological significance of the gourd and why it is able to infinitely refill itself with water, but I also found a couple of mind-blowing links between it and other From Software games. In order to provide clear and simple answers to these mysteries, I will need to start with some of the basic ideas from Eastern alchemy and then work my way back to the gourd. Otherwise, like with a lot of alchemical literature, it's probably going to make about as much sense as a predictive text mechanism based on Charles Manson.
Yeah, and I have like a very shallow understanding. Even saying like understanding is probably too strong wording here of like Eastern alchemy. And part of the reason for that is it's very pseudoscientific, obviously, and there's a lot of differences between periods of alchemy and influences throughout like regions. Like there's like the Chinese alchemy that would go on to influence like a lot of Asia and Japan, and then like Japanese ideas that go along with that, and then just like the weird fusion over time. And there's not a lot of really good scholarship on that to a Western audience to break it down in a kind of a straightforward, user-friendly way. And also trying to even look at like the Japanese stuff of it is like pretty difficult because finding quality Japanese articles that don't have like a ton of jargon and things to like wade through is just another difficult task, and just like trying to figure out like all the jargon and the references that jargon like harkens back to is another painful point in trying to go through all this stuff for like very little reward. Like is the juice worth the squeeze? Generally no. So I'll just kind of like dabble here and there and like learn a few things like with like this snake Viscera in Sekiro, or like how Yellowfinger Hazel is like the ring finger, or no, ring finger Leonard. What is Yellowfinger? Is that the middle finger? No, that's long finger is Kirk. So what's the yellow finger? Shouldn't be index, I don't think. Anyway, I forgot what I looked into apparently. Yeah, Scout Easy says, it doesn't help that FromSoft games are Japanese games with Western settings and themes. I do think a lot of people do get really tripped up with that kind of veneer of a Western game in FromSoft games. And I do think, obviously, FromSoft was very influenced by the West, but I do agree that they're kind of still fundamentally Eastern games. And as Beans and Rice says, a lot comes from Taoism. And with Taoism, Taoism got fused into like Buddhism in Japan especially, but not so much like China, although yes, also in China. There's so many different sects of Buddhism, even in China as well as Japan, and just like the overall evolution of the religions as they melded into Shintoism. It's just so blended, it's really hard to get a kind of a piece by piece breakdown that isn't ridiculously dry or just a kind of obscured in academia, perhaps. Jaundice finger hazel. No, so the whole like yellow finger thing comes down to it being like a medicine finger. So sure, jaundice, not really though. But I don't remember the significance of it. It might have been like it was the finger that like Buddha would hold while like doing certain poses or something like that. I'm probably misremembering. I know you're just messing around, but it's just to answer rhetorical questions directly. Sketchy Deer 50, welcome back to the stream. You said Jim Butcher does interviews with series like the Dresden Files. Does interviews with his series, the Dresden Files, and it fills in gaps we wouldn't normally learn about because the series is in first-person perspective and we wouldn't ever see those certain things. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And even with that said, I do think like having those kind of author or dev insights can be very fruitful, but I do understand when people would say like that's not necessarily canon to them, even as frustrating as it may be. All right, going back to Max's video.
First, I will note that the ideas we are using to explain the gourd come from Chinese Taoism, which to some might negate my theory at the outset, given Sekiro's Japanese setting. But remember, Japan was not immune to outside influence, as we clearly see with examples like the Buddha in Sekiro. Chinese Taoism was no exception. Second, the two primary goals of Western and Eastern alchemy are almost identical. One of those goals is the transmutation of lesser metals like lead into greater metals like gold. The other goal is the Philosopher's Stone, the container for the elixir of immortality. However, in Eastern alchemy, the stone tends to go by a different name, cinnabar. Nonetheless, the composition and function of both cinnabar and the Philosopher's Stone are virtually the same.
Yeah, and I don't know too much about this aspect of it, but I wondered if jade was also kind of like the goal of some of Chinese alchemy, but I don't really remember.
Third, the procurement of both prizes by both the Western and the Eastern alchemists is as much an external process as it is an internal process. The Taoist alchemists called these the Neitan and the Weitan. In other words, only the wisest, most worthy alchemist could become immortal.
I don't know Chinese super well, but I'm pretty sure... Okay, we're not going to see it like that.
Alchemists called these the Neitan.
So I'm pretty sure this would be like... Oh, he has it right here. Inner. I just need to read the English sometimes, guys.
And the Weitan. In other words,
yeah, okay.
Only the wisest, most worthy alchemist could become immortal. The internal and external methods for attaining the gold and or cinnabar are numerous, ranging from actual recipes to yogic positions. For now, I want to focus on the most pertinent example, one that should sound familiar to those who have watched my other videos linking alchemy to the Soulsborne games. I double verified this method when I read about it in the two books I previously cited on screen. One is called Chinese Alchemy by J.C. Cooper, and the other is The Forge and the Crucible by Mircea Eliade. Both of them emphasize the importance of a return to the source, or a return to the matrix. What this method refers to is a return to the state of the world as it was before it came into being, to the void. Within the primordial chaotic void, the universe and all its opposites were paradoxically contained in one unperceivable seed. Every opposite of life was contained in one source, from which life would soon eternally spring. By interacting with the void, one can find the source, extract the eternity within, and use it to fashion the elixir of immortality. But how does one interact with the void? For the Eastern alchemists, this would be done internally through meditation, and externally by being alone in a dark cave. Doing both simultaneously brings us into the closest contact with the void. both within and without. Now, if done correctly, the alchemist's prize will appear, but not in the form one might expect. According to Eliade, when the alchemist is alone and meditating, he cultivates cinnabar by taking heaven as his model and fashions earth. He seeks them by turning in on himself, and then finds that a heaven shaped like a gourd has come into spontaneous existence in his body. Indeed, when the alchemist achieves the chaotic state of unconsciousness, read as the void, he penetrates to the innermost recesses of his being. This inner space is in the form of a gourd.
So I believe this whole idea is that by meditating and being in contact with the ground, they open up their minds, which allows the ground to become connected to the heavens through them, and they become an extension of both. And that whole idea of the gourd looping in on itself might be like where we're coming into with this. But I might be wrong here. So let's see what Max has to say about the rest of this. And also welcome back to the stream without horns.
The implication here is that the immortality gifting substance resides within a gourd, and that it would appear within and without. But why a gourd? This is from Eliade. Quote, "The calabash, another name for gourd, plays a considerable part in Taoist ideology and folklore, and is regarded as representing the cosmos in miniature. In this gourd-shaped microcosm resides the source of life and youth. This theme, the universe having the shape of a calabash, is of undeniable antiquity. To put it more simply, the void at the beginning of time and the gourd are the same thing. Well, almost. Let's return to Sekiro for a moment. The void and the source would be more akin to the gourd seed, because the void at the beginning of time contained the seed that had yet to hatch. When it hatched and the universe sprang forth, the cosmos supposedly took the form of a gourd. Whether it is the void, the gourd seed, or the gourd fully formed, the wisest alchemist can extract from it the substance that gives life. Before I move on, there is one potential criticism I want to address. Eliade explicitly said that within the gourd is the cinnabar, which is different from the water that Sekiro drinks from his gourd. What one needs to keep in mind about alchemy is that there is a reason science replaced it following the Enlightenment era. It's because it's inconsistent. However, what alchemists can do is find the common patterns among the ideas and extract the common truths from therein. So for example, the cinnabar was its own thing, but it would also be equated with gold or the Western philosopher's stone. Most importantly, it was also equated with water. Water, in Chinese alchemy, was the fundamental material of creation, the life substance, the waters of life, and the prima materia. And prima materia was the name given by the alchemists to the void. Whether it is in the form of cinnabar, gold, or the rejuvenating water, all of them spring forth from the infinite source of life. Now here's where the good stuff begins. Some of you who have been watching my alchemy videos for a while now should easily recognize the term prima materia. I have linked that concept to the Age of Ancients from Dark Souls and the Crucible from Elden Ring. Both of them were the source of all life, the void, in their respective universes. And several characters in those games were trying to find ways to make contact with both in order to obtain immortality. It should also be noted that immortal dragons are associated with both the Age of Ancients and the Crucible. This is appropriate because the rejuvenating waters in Sekiro spring from the blood of dragons.
So, Sketchy Deer says, Cinnabar Island in Pokemon is the place where they did cloning experimentation on Mew and the others to try to make life. Yeah. And then we had some other comments about, like, whether or not Jade is Cinnabar and stuff. I don't really know. I don't know if it's supposed to be the equivalent of a Philosopher's Stone. I know Jade has, like, a lot of importance to Chinese myths specifically, or culture. but I don't remember if it was ever given like the same status as quite like the Philosopher's Stone was. However, with all that being said, one interesting thing about Cinnabar is that it does have a very high mercury count, and I wonder how much like the whole idea of mercury is going to tie into this as we move forward, because obviously like mercury has a lot of like really big significant ties to Western alchemy, but I'm not as familiar with Eastern alchemy to say if it does or not.
In summary.
Oh, Cinnabar Island is Grentol. Not sure if that's the same thing. I don't know what Guren is. Bright red, crimson lotus flower. Oh, okay, yeah. I see. Like red flower. Okay, so definitely not like Cinnabar.
The gourd in Sekiro is simply a microcosm, a handheld version of what the Crucible, the Age of Ancients, and the dragons in all these games are. The closer we are to their proximity, the closer we become to immortality. And that's not even the most mind-blowing part. Saddle up, because this is about to get good. No pun intended. If you will recall, I said that the Void and the Source were a paradoxical union of opposites. Polar opposites, like life and death, male and female, people who love Dark Souls 2 and those who hate it, were all contained in this seed. It was the job of the alchemist to produce superior concoctions by uniting opposites. This was true for the Western as well as the Eastern alchemists. It is also true that in order to determine which opposites to unify, that alchemists of the West and East would project gender onto the material world. Specifically for the Chinese Taoists, they projected the feminine yin and the masculine yang. I will cite two pertinent examples. First, the sun, whose corresponding metal was gold, was masculine, and the moon, whose corresponding metal was silver, was feminine. This is why, in Dark Souls, the character Gwendolyn was raised as a girl even though he was a boy. This is because he was born.
And it's also why Guinevere, who is female, was raised as a male because she was associated with the sun.
With an affinity.
Obviously that was sarcasm.
For moon-related magic. The second example is the union of the colors red and white, which Cooper talks about in his book. Quote, "In the process of obtaining the elixir, there are the stages of red and white, familiar to both East and West. For the Chinese, they would sometimes use the gourd as an alchemic tool to unite red and white elements." Quote, "It was believed that the elixir of immortality could be produced through the distilling of red cinnabar placed in the upper chamber of the gourd and mercury placed in the lower chamber. The marriage of these two substances was a sexual metaphor for the union of semen and menstrual blood to create life. This type of procedure and its symbolism is confirmed by Eliade. One way the Chinese alchemists would try to produce the gourd materially was by hanging upside down while meditating. This would, supposedly, cause a man's semen to travel up his body into the recesses of his brain, where the blood and the semen would form the alchemical embryo. This area of the brain went by many names, including Tantien, the Cinnabar Fields, and most importantly, Kunlun, a name given to a mountain of mythical importance. Eliade.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure like the Kunlun Mountain is very integral to like a lot of martial art training stories, where people like would scale it and like fight up there, and the winners of like the tournaments up there would be like recognized as the strongest in the realms. But yeah, I'm not like super familiar with that though. So Scalisi's chemistry teacher in high school legitimately had heavy metal poisoning. How did that happen? Don't ask how Western alchemists tried to make homunculi then. Oh yeah. There were a bunch of spices called cinnabar that have nothing to do with actual cinnabar. Weird. Okay.
Notes that the mountain of Kunlun has two tiers. an upright circular cone surmounted by an inverted one, similar to the alchemist's furnace. In this way, Eliade states that both Kunlun and the gourd were images of the world in little, a universe in miniature. The unity of red and white, male and female, is something that we see in Elden Ring with the characters of Radagon and Marika. This is because they were both the same person until Radagon split off from Marika. As pointed out by a fellow YouTuber named Ziostorm, this union of male and female is similar to a concept from Western alchemy known as the rebus. According to the English alchemist of the 15th century, George Ripley, the rebus was the personification of the philosopher's stone, because of this union of male and female. But note that I said personification, because the man and the woman weren't actually being united. It was the elements they represented being united. Those elements were sulfur and mercury. Now hold on to your seats, guys, because this is the good part. What is produced when you actually unify sulfur and mercury in real life? You get mercury sulfide. And what is the non-scientific name for mercury sulfide? Cinnabar.
Philosopher's Stone. So Azimith Leo, welcome back. Bloodborne is majestic, yes. Scally said, you think it definitely involved semen and feces in a jar, but you can't remember what else they did? Something about horses? Your chemistry teacher? Or no, are you talking about the Western homunculi? I'm assuming. I'm assuming that one. I hope that one. Oh, you think they would try to reproduce the creature in a horse's womb? Yeah, I totally believe it. Yeah. No, it was your chemistry teacher. You don't need to cover for them.
But wait! There's more!
What other From Software game features the colors red and white? That would be Bloodborne. In that game, you can become a pseudo-immortal god by defeating the Moon Presence boss at the end of the game, thereby attaining that game's version of the elixir, Pale Blood. What color is the moon in that game? At times, it is white, but it can also be red. By way of the red and white moon, one may transcend. If you want to learn more about Bloodborne's relation to alchemical ideas, check out my video titled Bloodborne's Hidden Secret to Becoming a God, which I will link in the description box. Once again, I am blown away by the symbolic depth these games possess. I don't know if it's Miyazaki or somebody else from the team that is doing this, but whoever it is, he really knows his shit. Anyways, that does it for this video. If you liked it, please give it a like before you tune out. It's quick, free, and helps me out a lot. By the way, if you like the type of in-depth analysis that I do here, please consider supporting me on Patreon, Subscribestar, or joining my YouTube member section. I will leave a link to all of those in the description box below. Thanks guys, and until next time, remember to fear the old blood, don't you dare go hollow, something tarnished, stay yellow. Bye-bye.
Later!
Don't give up, skeleton. Scowleezy, you sound like an absolute monster, and you got an innocent person fired from their job. Way to go. Without Horn said, you're still not convinced that Radagon wasn't a separate person to start with? Yeah, you don't need to be convinced about that. It's arguable. Is the common element of Scowleezy? Yeah. Scowleezy is the canonical villain in the chat room right now. So, okay. I enjoyed this video. I am a little bit disappointed that there wasn't more to tie in like Sekiro and Elden Ring beyond like the gourd stuff. I thought there was going to be more of like a unified theory, but that's not like too important, just as much as like Max wanting to share off some of the alchemical connections between the East and West. And with this being such a self-contained video, I can't really blame him. I don't expect Max to have gotten like a super in-depth run through of Eastern philosophy through the millennia, which is perfectly fine there. But nonetheless, I am kind of tired of like the alchemical stuff, especially with like the whole like rebus comments between America and Radagon. And this is not so much a criticism of Max here as much as it is just coming like hot off the heels of Smotown's video yesterday where he went into it as well as, of course, some of Max's other stuff with Crunchy and it just being a very common thing in the lore community right now, whereas I feel like it's at most maybe more of a like loose inspiration rather than, I think, more of a literal one, at least to me. Yeah, I am a bit Rebus Philbined out. Yeah, Kolo thinks people are focusing too much on alchemy and missing the point. So the one thing that keeps coming up into my mind with the whole like Rebus and the alchemy stuff is, isn't it a bit reductive to say that it's a marriage of both male and female elements if Mariko was female to begin with? It's kind of like an inversion of the whole like Adam and Eve thing, where Eve is made out of Adam's rib, whereas this time it's Adam made out of Eve's rib, with Mariko representing Adam essentially and Eve being Radigan. But if they were all female to begin with, she kind of like makes the masculine form and then reintegrates it into herself. It just seems a little bit circular to me, which might be what like the alchemy is trying to get at here, especially with the whole like return to the void stuff. But I just probably need to do a bit more research. But of course, since it doesn't really ring that true to me, I don't really care enough to do it, to be quite frank. Should cleanse my palate with some Berserk videos. No, maybe I'll go back to watching some Ava. I'll let the Berserk stuff like fester for a while. I'll eventually go back and reread the series and get like up to speed, but definitely put a bit of downer on things after hearing the news, to keep it vague. Sketchy Deer says they also physically swap between the two. It didn't look like they were a merger of both. SNX recommends some Destiny lore videos. To be honest, I'm not really that into Destiny lore, but that's because I assumed, like all other MMOs, its lore was going to be made up and not really matter. But they've been somewhat consistent with it over the years, which I guess kind of surprised me, but nonetheless, the story is a little bit wonky at times, but I guess like the lore is good. I do like aspects of the lore, but in general, I can't take like space magic too seriously, whereas I can take fake high fantasy magic too seriously. I don't know, it's a weird discrepancy on my part, I admit. Yes, Knucklehead. The video where I talk about Rom is the Bloodborne True Story Explained. I think I also talk about it a bit more when I made a video about like what the great ones are, and I have like a thumbnail of Rom saying that she's the great one. Although I don't really think I go into too much detail about her role in the story specifically, as much as I just lay out that she should be considered a great one and not just a kin. Kolo says, as someone who intends to eventually develop games with deep lore, any tips on how to write the lore of a series? Yes. Always leave yourself enough room where you never commit to anything, so that way you can say whatever you want and nobody can call you out on it. Just pull a pro Miyazaki. Space magic? You mean astrology? Something like that. Astrology, alchemy, same thing. Actually, speaking about like astrology and alchemy, maybe it'd be, I don't want to say like it's worth looking at Full Metal Alchemist in this context, because it's obviously like super fictionalized, but I know in the eastern region of Full Metal Alchemist, lol, because everything east is Asia, right? Even in like the fiction, they do have like a different form of alchemy that Edward can try to learn and stuff. I don't want to say too much beyond that, but maybe that would be worth considering like doing a bit more research into. Not like research in that aspect of like Full Metal Alchemist, but just like where that idea fits in, where like Eastern alchemy isn't exactly Western alchemy in that universe, and what inspired that belief in the author to begin with. Yeah, even in Japan, everything to the east is Asia, indeed. Alright, but that will be it for me for tonight. I would like to thank you all for joining me, as always. Again, I will be postponing streaming for 1 to 2 days, depending on how the Destiny rating and stuff goes. So most likely I will be live again on Sunday at 10 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, if not Saturday. So just make sure you click the stupid bell for warnings, for alerts, or join the Discord where I send out like a ping before I go live every time I do, and all that fun stuff. So hope you guys stay safe and that we will see each other in the next stream. Take care. That'll be it for me. Last Protagonist out.